behaving disgracefully. I have eaten animal flesh and I've enjoyed it. I tell you, you're beautiful. But you are beautiful.
Bridge to all decks. Welcome aboard a very special, super-sized episode of Enterprise Incidents with Scott and Steve. I'm Scott Nance.
And I'm Steve Morrison. I have finally decided that I'm going to survive by going back in time to the late 60s so I can watch Star Trek in its original release. That's my plan.
That would have been a hell of a thing to watch Star Trek when it was on NBC, you know, every week instead of having to watch it in syndication, which I'm actually happy that I did, because that is how I discovered Star Trek. And I remember, Steve, when we first started doing this journey on Enterprise Incidents, going through each episode in production order, you're like, what episodes are you really looking forward to talking about? And of course, I mentioned Metamorphosis and City on the Edge of Forever and all those, classics. But there was one episode that I mentioned that I couldn't wait to talk about, but I didn't want to rush to get there because that would have meant that we're close to the very, very end of our journey in the original series. And that is the episode that we're going to cover on this podcast episode. And that is All Our Yesterdays. And before I introduce our very special guests, another big announcement is that what better way to bring our journey of the original series to a close by having two special guests on this episode. Following our deep dive conversation of all our yesterdays, we're going to be joined for a very special interview by the man himself. That's right, William Shatner is going to join us for a conversation, a very far out philosophical and profound conversation. Steve is laughing for good reason. That's going to follow our conversation about all our yesterdays. But joining us for our deep dive, joining us again, welcome back aboard Enterprise Incidents. He was here for the Enterprise Incident, our namesake episode. He is back with us now. Welcome back, Adam Nimoy.
Thank you for having me, Scott. It's great to be back.
Okay, well, the first question is really just I'm going to start with you, Adam, on this. What was your take on All Our Yesterdays, especially when you did your rewatch for Enterprise Incidents?
Well, I love that episode. I think it's a really, really good episode. I'm sorry that the season 3 didn't end on that episode. It's a good, strong Spock episode. It's really interesting in terms of dynamic between Spock and McCoy and their relationship. And, and I love Mariette Hartley. I just think she's fabulous in this episode. It's nice to see another Spock love interest after all the women that Kirk got to kiss through three seasons of Star Trek. It's nice that the writers and producers thought to also have romantic interludes for Spock. And we've seen that several times in Enterprise Incident and Cloudminders and
This Side of Paradise.
And This Side of Paradise, of course. So, yeah, one of my favorites. So I think it's a really good, strong episode to kind of wind up the season on.
Sure. Steve, what about you? What were your thoughts like all those years ago, all your yesterdays? And what was your take during your rewatch?
Well, it's funny because I've known for a long time that this one was one of your favorites because you brought it up many times. And I always kind of went, and what I always remembered was, I love the Spock McCoy back in the past story and didn't like so much the he's a witch part of the story. And watching it this time, we had this one conversation of what's the last great episode of Star Trek. And I said, maybe it's Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. And you said you think it's All Our Yesterdays. And I think for the stuff that's good, it is absolutely great. That stuff with the Spock story is really incredible and was great to watch this time.
It really is. And both of you brought up the dynamic between Spock and McCoy in this episode, which really does come full circle through 3 seasons of the original series, which is basically the entire 5-year mission, to have it culminate with that heated moment in the past, even though Spock is affected by it being in the past. But it really brought everything to a boil. All the tension between them really came to a boil, and it was really sort of the perfect way for the original series to go out. But there are so many things about All Our Yesterdays that I really love, not just because it is, Steve, I have to mention this. It is photo novel number 6. It is the last time I'm going to mention the photo novels because it is the last episode that we're covering to have a photo novel. But I've seen a lot of fans on our Facebook page comment about how this is sort of the Spock version of City on the Edge of Forever because he goes back in time. It's not back in Earth's time, but it is back in a time on a planet that is very similar to Earth. But I love that it is there's two stories going on at once. That Kirk is in one time period and Spock and McCoy are in the other, and Kirk has to get back to the future to save Spock and McCoy, and then this star Beta Niobe is about to go nova and destroy Sarpedon. It's just there's a whole lot of drama in this episode, and it's ironically you never see the inside of the Enterprise in this episode, and it's also the last episode to feature just the big three: William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley. But the episode started out as a story outline written by Jean Lassette Arrest, who wrote the episode "Is There in Truth No Beauty," which is another top third season classic. And it started out. It was called A Handful of Dust when that story outline was submitted on September 23rd, 1968. Arrest proceeded to a first draft when it was called All Our Yesterdays. The title was brought on by producer Fred Freiberger. And like so many episodes of the original series, All Our Yesterdays comes from Shakespeare. In this case, Macbeth, Act 5, Scene 5, line 22, which reads, "And all our yesterdays have lighted fools, the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle." And this is also the passage that reads, "It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Arthur Singer did his rewrite, his final draft on December 12th. And then Fred Freiberger did a script polish in which he made a lot of really strong changes, which was submitted on December 17th. All Our Yesterdays aired on March 14th, 1969. It was the 78th episode to air. And it wasn't for another 3 months that the final episode, which is Turnabout Intruder, finally aired. But the episode was filmed, All Our Yesterdays, between December 20th and December 30th, 1968. The last original series episode to be filmed in 1968, shot on schedule in 6 days. So it was the 79th episode to film, if you include the cage. The total cost for All Our Yesterdays was $182,466, which bought it just a measly $744 over budget. And it is worth noting that All Our Yesterdays is the last episode of the original series to be nominated for an Emmy. It was nominated for Outstanding Achievement in Art Direction and Scenic Design. The nomination went to art director Walter Matt Jeffries and set decorator John Dwyer. Absolutely deserved. This episode really does look good. It was also the only other episode other than the Paradise Syndrome to be shot outside.
Would you like to know some of the things going on in the world?
Let's hear it.
Well, it starts off pretty scary. On December 20th, high school students Betty Lou Jennison and David Friday were shot and killed near Benicia, California, which is pretty near where I grew up. And they were the first confirmed victims of the Zodiac Killer.
Oh, wow.
We had mentioned this in our last episode, but the woman who had been kidnapped, Barbara Jane Mackey, was rescued also on December 20th. I don't usually bring up births and deaths, but this one was an important person to me. And this is that Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winner John Steinbeck died on December 20th, 1968. One of my absolute favorite writers. On December 21st, Apollo 8 became the first manned spaceship to break out of Earth orbit, with Frank Borman, Jim Lovell from, of course, Apollo 13, and Willem Anders. They went further from Earth than any people in history. On December 22nd, the Down in the Countryside movement began in China, and this is where Mao Zedong decided that, you know what? We need all the youth who are going to these fancy colleges and getting educations. They need to go out and work on the farm. And so over 16 million students were pulled out of colleges to work agriculturally. And this was one of the many, many really stupid decisions made by Chairman Mao that put China in a really bad spot. Our first episode with Adam was the Enterprise incident. And guess what? On December 22nd, the 82 crew members of the USS Pueblo from the Pueblo incident were finally released by North Korea.
Wow.
So that's a long time that they had spent in North Korea. On December 24th, Apollo 8 became the first humans in history to see the far side of the moon. And they, while orbiting the moon 10 times a day, they took a photo that became known as Earthrise. And
And they
Earthrise is
also, Earthrise is a great photo, and it was taken by Bill Anders. And also that night on Christmas Eve, they read from the Book of Genesis.
And on the 27th, they returned safely to Earth. And that's what was going on in the world while this episode was being made.
That's awesome.
Shall we enter all our yesterdays?
Let's go through the portal.
So we hear in a log that this sun is going to go nova in 3.5 hours, and we beam down to a planet looking for intelligent life, and there are no signs of intelligent life. We have Spock, McCoy, and Kirk, and they are at this building saying this is a major power source, and they're speculating on how can a whole planet full of people just disappear.
The planet is called Sarpedon. It is the only satellite around Beta Niobe, which is about 3.5 hours away from going supernova. And just, for the sake of science fiction, I love this concept that the star is about to go nova, and instead of escaping off the planet, everyone goes back in time. But that's not really how novas work. It takes many, many, many years for a star to actually go nova. But you know what? For Star Trek, it's okay. You can suspend your disbelief and just go with it.
So they're speculating on what could have happened to them. They don't have space flight, and they go into this building, which appears to be a library. By the way, I think this is a great set. I feel like it's like we're back in the first season in terms of some of the design, and we have some extras.
I agree. This feels like a first or second season episode, and the idea to not use the Enterprise sets at all. You never see the interior of the Enterprise in this episode. It's the only Star Trek episode to lay that claim. But by not firing up Stage 9, which is where all the Enterprise sets were, that's where they saved money. And basically, I mean, other than a few $100, they brought the episode in on schedule and on budget.
And just as they're talking about how all the people are gone, we hear,
I am the librarian. May I be of assistance?
That would be Mr. Ataz. So, Mr. Ataz, a librarian, Mr. A2Z. How clever is that? When did you guys pick up on that? I had to read about it before the light went on in my head.
Yeah, I had to read about it as well. Yeah, I did not pick up on that at all.
Well, Mr. Ataz is played by Ian Wolfe, and Ian Wolfe will look familiar to Star Trek fans because he played Septimus in the second season classic Bread and Circuses.
When we meet Mr. Ataz, this is one of my first real problems with this episode, which is dumb, but it bugs me, which is that what is it that Captain Kirk does whenever he meets new people? We've seen him do it over and over and over again in episodes of Star Trek.
I don't know. What does he do?
He introduces himself. I am Captain James T. Kirk from the Federation Starship Enterprise. If he just introduced himself at the beginning of this and said, hey, we're from another planet, we were checking on you before your star explodes, none of this would have happened.
You're right. Because Mr. Ataz thinks that these three people are citizens of Sarpedon. He has no idea they're from another planet until Kirk tells him that, like, after all the stuff hits the fan.
In the fourth act. And it's and so it's all this misunderstanding, and they just keep letting the misunderstanding go until terrible things happen.
Right.
Yeah, it really bothers me.
Yeah, the Starfleet uniforms didn't inform Mr. Ataz at all as to their alien nature.
Or Spock's ears in his eyes. He doesn't comment on that at all either.
I confess that I'm a little surprised to see you. I had thought that everyone had long since gone. But the surprise is a pleasant one. After all, a library serves no purpose unless someone is using it.
So at this point, Steve, you're right. I mean, it's something I never thought about. If Kirk just would have introduced himself as being Captain James T. Kirk from the Starship Enterprise and introducing Spock and McCoy, none of this would have happened. But perhaps they were just like, well, we don't know what's going on here. We don't want to shock this person by saying we're from another world because they don't have space travel. So I'm kind of down with him not, shocking this person saying we're from another planet. But at the same time, the way that Kirk and Spock and McCoy play their hand with this, they're trying to determine what happened to everybody without coming right out and asking more direct questions, because Mr. Ataz is very, very vague in where everybody went. They don't know that everybody went in the past yet. So you're right. This all was a misunderstanding that could have been, nipped in the bud really, really early. But by trying to just sort of like ease into where everybody went, that's where the complications really ensue. But I still think it works.
I just want to say it was kind of interesting that Mr. Ataz was trying to maintain everybody's confidentiality as to where they went. Why that is very unclear to me as to why nobody can know where anybody else went in the past. I'm not sure what the benefit of the confidentiality agreement is all about.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that that people have used the thing I love obviously is these whole portals. I mean, they look like DVDs, and it's very prescient. It's technology. It's very simple what they did in terms of the props, but also very forward thinking in terms of what they were looking at the library to determine what their destination would be.
Oh yeah, those files were definitely DVDs. One of many examples of just how Star Trek was way, way, way ahead of its time.
Absolutely. And Ataz gestures for them. No, go look over there. And they start walking over there. And there is another Mr. Ataz.
May I help you?
And this is the misunderstanding, is he's thinking, oh, these are just people and I have to do my job to help them find a time to go back to. And they don't understand what's going on. And Ataz directs him to the reference desk, which they walk back to. And who is at the reference desk?
Mr. Ataz.
You're very late. Where have you been? You're a very agile man, Mr. Ataz. Just how many of you are there?
Okay, what do you think of this teaser, Adam?
You're putting me on the spot here, Scott. You're putting me on the Spock. I don't think of the teaser. I don't know. It seems somewhat typical to me. It's a little light-handed. A little more drama would have been much more interesting to me. Mr. Ataz is, it didn't draw me in initially. It really isn't what the allure of the show is really about. It would have been nice if there was more, something more to tease us as to what we're going to be seeing ahead of ourselves.
I agree with you. As much as I love this episode, the teaser doesn't really set up the drama that is about to unfold. Like when you look at the great teasers like Mirror Mirror and the Doomsday Machine, or Sitting on the Edge of Forever. Steve, what's your take on the teaser?
I agree with both of you. I think it's focusing us on why are there multiple Mr. Atazes and the strange mystery rather than everyone's going to die. The planet's going to explode. We have, the elements that we're going to get to of time travel and stuff like that. Those are the dramatic ones. The multiple Mr. Atazes is not that interesting to me.
I agree. And just some notes, in earlier versions of the teleplay, it was more firmly established that the replicas of Mr. Ataz were actually robot attendants. That's not alluded to at all in the finished episode. There's really no explanation for why he has a replicant. But anyway, like I said, this is the only episode of the original series in which the interior of the Enterprise is never seen, and the only original series episode to feature just the three leads, even though you do hear Scotty's voice over the communicator towards the end of the episode. And interesting note that the writer, Jean Lassette Arrest, so this was her second teleplay after Is There in Truth No Beauty. These are the only two writing credits she had. She never wrote for television again, but at least her second hand at writing for television was an episode about a library, because at the time she was a librarian at UCLA.
Oh, nice. We come back in Act 1, and again, we're going to continue to not quite explain. Ataz is not going to do a good job of explaining what happened, and they're not going to explain where they come from. But what we do find out is that they knew about this Nova coming and that everyone is now safe.
Where did they go?
And the answer, and this is, I love just how do we keep this mystery going?
Wherever they wanted to go, of course. It is strictly up to the individual's choice.
It's almost like a who's on first. You know what I mean? Like they keep getting answers that don't quite make sense.
Adam, we talked about how there were a number of late third season episodes where, first of all, we've graded on a curve because clearly the quality wasn't as good as the beginning of the third season, and certainly not the first or the second season. But one of the comments that Steve and I have pointed out is to how there were certain times when when the episode felt like it was being dragged out with filler. And my opinion is all this back and forth talk. Are you the real Mr. Ataz? Are you sure? Yeah, he's quite real, Jim. That to me is just filler. Like, okay, we get it. There's a main one and there's replicas. Let's move on. I feel like this was actually slowing the episode down. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's much more that could have been made of all that at the beginning. There are a lot of story points that are not explored. There are a lot of setups that pay off later on that are really not created. It's kind of a missed opportunity. On the other hand, you have to understand the way these shows are made. I mean, this is the end of the season.
Yeah.
Scripts get later as the season goes on. It's a very short shooting period. They have to save money at the end of the season. There's a good likelihood they're not going to get picked up again. Maybe the network executives know that, and they're starting to put tighter screws on the budget for the show. And we have a new writer here. People are tired. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into play. And a 6-day shoot is a 6-day shoot. I mean, this is one of the big problems with Star Trek, and this episode in particular for me is there's not enough coverage. They don't really have enough screen time at very incredibly emotional moments that we'll talk about more later. But yeah, I mean, I agree. A lot of this is just filler dialogue when they could be talking about more philosophical things about how a planet deals with catastrophe, how they've developed this technology to send people back in time, how people decide where back in time they're going to go, what is the rich history of this planet. I mean, there's so many other things, what's the allure and how even, another story point that comes up later is how you prepare for this journey to go back in time and what it was like for people to leave their home planet. I mean, there's so much rich stuff that goes unexplored that I think is a missed opportunity. And yes, we get a lot of filler at the beginning of the show.
I want to ask Adam, you brought up something really crucial here. This is the end of the third season. This is the second to the last episode that was being filmed. So do you have any memories, any recollections of what your father's mood was like about Star Trek by this point, because they were not getting any word from NBC or Paramount about getting picked up for a third season. In fact, the third season was actually truncated from 26 episodes to 24, which is not a good sign for a show that is looking to get picked up for a fourth season. So the question is, did you sense that your father's morale was down, or was he just like, okay, you know what? It's been 3 years with like all the makeup and all this, and well, I'm ready to move on to something else, and I'm actually relieved.
Well, I was very detached by then from what was going on the series because I was so disappointed in some of the shows, the quality that we were seeing in the third season that we were not watching as a family regularly, every Thursday or Friday night at this point.
Yeah.
The Kiss of Death is when they rescheduled it. What's interesting, Scott, is I was not that involved with what was happening, and my dad was very, as usual, he simply was not around. Now, what's interesting to me is that in October of '68, we moved into our new house in Westwood. So my father all of a sudden had larger financial obligations. It was a big move up for us. We had really arrived. We were living in a 2-bedroom, essentially what was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom home in West LA that my parents kind of had to convert the den into a master bedroom for themselves because it was just too small. So
Wow.
that was going on at the time, and it's kind of interesting going into it and going into the end of this season and not having Gene Roddenberry there and the dynamic of the whole show was definitely changing. Now, this was not something that he necessarily shared with me at the time, but I knew there was a lot of concern about what the future would bring. I mean, the fact of the matter is, third season, another Emmy nomination for Leonard. So this is the other interesting thing I think about the third season is those guys did not give up on the quality of the work. I still think that they really were invested in it and they really believed in it and they really gave it their all. It was a great opportunity. I think they wanted to go out with a bang. I think that the three of them do. I mean, yeah, the B story that Bill Shatner has to work with is much more challenging. There's just not that much going on there, but I really believe that that they felt still strongly committed to the show at that point.
Excellent. Yep.
I think whenever they have good scripts to work with, they're always giving it their all. And even with lesser scripts, you could see them valiantly trying to do something. I want to go back to something that you said before, Adam, which is, what could have been done with this space. And you were talking about what's interesting to me. A while ago, I said that I think when Star Trek's at its best, it's when it has a great sense of adventure, a interesting science fiction idea, and something that's emotionally resonant for the characters. And what's the thing about this episode, there's a super interesting science fiction idea, which is going back to the past to survive your planet getting destroyed, that I really don't think they explore at all. Like, I think they just really don't deal with it. And then because of all this other stuff they're doing, all this time with Mr. Atoz and the B story with Kirk, is the really emotional core of the story doesn't get all the time that maybe I wish that it could, you know? So it's got elements of the things that make great Star Trek episodes. And when it is great, it's really great. But, you know, the places that misses a little bit too. But what we're having right now is that Kirk is looking at one of these cool discs that you mentioned before and looking at some old-timey town, and McCoy is looking at something in an ice age. And Spock walks over to Mr. Atoz because he is working with what seems to me to be a very familiar piece of equipment.
Oh, it sure is, Steve. That familiar piece of equipment was last seen. It's the computer in Assignment Earth, and Steve is a big fan of when Star Trek was able to save money by reusing props or costumes. And Steve, your eye is right on point by noticing this. It looks familiar, but this device is called the Atavachron. And Steve, this continues your theory that things are sort of alluded to without ever being quite explained. And all Atoz does is explain that I will prepare you through the Atavachron without ever actually explaining exactly what that means. And the addition of the Atavachron to this episode was one of the additions made by Fred Freiberger that actually made this a better episode, a more dramatic episode that increased the stakes.
And then as Kirk is looking through his particular disc, he hears a scream.
Spock, Bones.
And then runs through this door and has a very intense effect, and he disappears.
And that's when this episode really kicks into high gear, because as soon as Kirk disappears through the portal, McCoy and Spock at the same time go through and disappear themselves. And that is immediately when the energy and the excitement and the dramatic effect of this episode really, really, really does take hold. And it stays that way until literally the last moment.
You know what I always do when I'm building a portal that could take you to other times? I usually put like a door in front of it or something so that people can't actually just jump through it the wrong moment. I think you'd have some kind of safety feature here. But Kirk ends up in some old sort of medieval, or not medieval, some old-timey place, and sees this woman being attacked by some soldiers.
So originally, in one of the earlier versions of the screenplay, the teleplay, the outline, it had Kirk going back in time to San Francisco's Barbary Coast. And it had Spock and McCoy going to a barren desert, not the Ice Age, where they had to protect themselves from mutant humanoids. Again, this is where Freiberger said, "Know what? Let's change Kirk's time from the Barbary Coast of San Francisco to Victorian England, Charles II, to be exact." And then, of course, Spock and McCoy going back to the Ice Age. And, so it's like by the end of the season, Freiberger really got some good points about Star Trek, and he made some great changes to this episode.
So Kirk rescues this woman from her attackers. And then we go back to McCoy and Spock, who are in this freezing ice age. And Spock goes, well, naturally, what we do in a freezing ice age, I'm going to use my phaser to heat up some rocks. And his phaser doesn't work. I think Star Trek has leaned on phasers magically not working way, way too many times.
And also, the phasers don't work. But later on, when Spock is using McCoy's medical equipment, right, that works. So Adam, you mentioned before, like the Spock McCoy stuff in the past worked better for you than you thought maybe that the Kirk stuff did. Like why do you think that the Kirk part isn't as fully realized as the Spock and McCoy stuff?
I just had trouble with the way the characters were drawn in the era that Kirk was in. I mean, they've been in trouble before, where they've been locked up or unable to, or somehow restrained. A lot of determining how well our protagonist does is based on who the antagonist is, and there's nothing that threatening to me, to just put him, lock him up and have a Grand Inquisitor come down and talk to him. The characters are just not well drawn, and the woman who accuses him of witchcraft, I mean, they're kind of caricatures. This is the part of Star Trek that sometimes it works and sometimes it troubles me, because again, it can be sometimes tongue in cheek and not to be taken seriously, and it works. Sometimes that does work, and then sometimes it's very serious, and they're making some very really weighty arguments about moral decisions and these kind of things. None of that is happening in the Kirk story. This is all happening with Spock and McCoy in their story, and it's just it's not well balanced in that respect. So it just felt like there's really no danger for Kirk. There's nothing interesting for him to try to challenge him, to use his ingenuity to change the minds of people. I mean, there is some interest in the prosecutor coming down to interrogate him, but other than that, I just don't think there's just not enough at stake, I think, for him in that storyline.
Steve, what do you think?
I completely agree with what Adam. It feels to me like they went, okay, we've got this Spock McCoy story. We got to come up with a Kirk story. What are we going to? And they just made a thing up. I don't feel emotionally involved in it. I think the woman's performance, whose name I don't know, but I think she's fun. It's an interesting performance, but I am not involved in Kirk's story. I think this would have been a much better episode if Kirk, Spock, and McCoy had all gone back to the Ice Age and we just lived in that conflict. I think that would have been, because that's where the drama is happening.
All right, I'm gonna disagree with both of you on this, because first of all, the Mort, the woman, Steve, is played by Anna Karen, whose first TV credit was Lights Out in 1950. She was also on TV shows like Peyton Place and even Marcus Welby, MD. But I actually think that separating Kirk from Spock and McCoy heightens the drama. And while I do agree completely with you, Adam, that the other characters in the Charles II time are a little one-dimensional and caricatures, especially the Mort, I think that separating Kirk from Spock and McCoy, where he, yeah, sure, he's in a jail cell, and that sort of limits like the action he can do. I feel like he makes the most of it, especially when he knocks out the jailer. But I think, and we'll get to this, I think the scene between him and the prosecutor is actually really, really well directed and very well written. And look, Kirk has to get back through the portal, wherever that is, find Spock and McCoy, save Spock and McCoy, get the Enterprise out of there before Beta Niobe goes Nova. So I think that the dramatic stakes for Kirk are actually quite high. They're just different stakes than the ones being faced by Spock and McCoy 5,000 years in the past.
Scott, I might just want to interject one thing that I find kind of interesting. When we see a show like A Piece of the Action, we know what we're being given. We know what we're watching. It's consistent throughout. I feel there's a little inconsistency here that I have trouble adjusting to, because it feels tongue in cheek what's going on with Kirk a little bit. It's a little bit of a wink in the eye, to the audience that we're going to have some fun here. And I just feel that there's been so many great moments where there's something to really be overcome, or there's something that's really threatening to Kirk, that really challenging to him, that I just feel is missing. And again, juxtaposed against the A story, which is really the Kirk and McCoy story, it's just hard to reconcile the two.
You better come back with me to the library. You'll be safe there. Dr. McCoy can see to those bruises.
All right, so here's what I actually really like about this scene. While she's talking, Shatner's performance here is really subtle, but it works. He's like, while she's talking, he's like looking around like, wait a minute, I was just in this like futuristic library, and now I'm in something that looks like the past. How did I get here? It's like it's starting to take hold that he is not where he was.
I'm game, love. Leading our father. Where's library?
Right over there.
And then he looks, and that's the sting on the episode. He's like, wait, where the heck is the library?
It was never clear to me that the discs had changed to put them in different time periods.
Right.
This is a little bit, it's a detail, but it's a plot point that, these kind of, from a directing point of view and a storytelling point of view, these things always annoy me. When did the discs change so that they were not being headed towards different time periods on the planet? That was confusing to me.
That's a really good point, because, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I think they didn't change. I think what the implication is that Kirk was looking at this Charles II time period, and McCoy was looking at an Ice Age time period, and so it sent them where each of them were individually looking at on different viewers. I think that's what the implication is.
But without like Adam, I understand what Adam's saying. Like what was it about the discs, the DVDs rather, that they were looking at that made them go back to their different time periods? Maybe if ATOS had activated the Atavachron, that would have made more sense. They would have gone to the different times, but it's not fully explained. But I just this was another instance of this episode where there was so much that I was really liking about it that I just went with it.
Again, I go back to maybe have a big warning sign or a door or a barrier so these kind of mistakes can't happen.
Bones, Spock?
Captain, we hear you, but we cannot see you. Are you all right?
And her reaction to these strange voices coming from nowhere are pretty big.
Mercy on us. It's spirits.
No. These are friends of mine. They're... Spock, are you in the library?
Indeed not. We're in a wilderness of Arctic characteristics.
He means it's cold.
And this is where they figure out, like, oh, they were escaping back into the past. So now they understand what the plot is.
I'd say this is where, Steve, like you pointed out, how they make the best use of exposition in a way that it works. So all this stuff about the Atavachron and being, going back into the past, and that's how the people of Sarpedon were able to escape the Nova, by going back to the past. But because Kirk and Spock and McCoy are talking to each other through the door of the library, so to speak, in different time periods, it works, especially because Spock and McCoy are shouting over the wind and over the cold, and their situation is dire because they're freezing. But then just as they're explaining all of this, Kirk gets interrupted by some reinforcements.
Because the woman who he rescued actually was a thief. And so now they think that Kirk is also a thief, and he's trying to talk to McCoy and Spock, and they're hearing these voices.
What's happening?
Lord help us, what's that?
It's spirits.
Away, spirit!
And Kirk is trying to get them to keep talking, and finally they go, the only way we can shut this guy up is by knocking him out. And so they punch him, and they take Kirk away.
Jim sounded like he was in trouble. We may be in trouble ourselves. We must find shelter.
And now McCoy is having a rough time. Because their little skimpy Starfleet outfits are not really made for this kind of weather, and he goes down and tries to get Spock to go on without him.
We go together or not at all. Don't be a fool.
Remember back in Spock's brain, when they first beamed down to the planet, there's a moment where Kirk says to adjust the temperature in your uniforms. It was the only time this was ever used in the original series. And I guess it would have been something that would have taken away a lot of drama like this if they would have kept using it. But Kirk does make a mention for Scotty and Chekhov to adjust the temperature in their uniforms in that episode. And it was an interesting device that they used, I guess, just that one time.
And as they're having the classic leave me behind argument, we see a figure wrapped in furs that turns to go, and Spock lifts up McCoy, and we follow them. And we make it inside her cave, which I think the design in this cave is really beautiful. Is it some of the same set pieces from A Private Little War?
That's a really good question. I didn't say specifically where those set pieces came from, but I thought that, I was really missing the cinematography of Jerry Finnerman in the second part of the third season. I just felt like so much of the lighting was just bland. But in this case, in this episode, for the stuff in the past with Kirk, and certainly in the cave with Spock and McCoy and this character that will soon be introduced as Zarabeth, I thought the lighting was really exceptional, and one of the reasons why justifiably this episode was nominated for an Emmy for the set design.
I had the same reaction and wrote down the same thing. It looks like the lighting is back to the first season. It looks really good. And Spock is sort of tending to McCoy, and then off comes that hood, and we see Zarabeth for the first time.
We see a very pretty young woman played by Mariette Hartley. Mariette Hartley is an Emmy winner for playing Carolyn Fields in The Incredible Hulk. She was nominated for an Emmy 3 other times. She was also on Peyton Place, Death Valley Days, Bonanza. She was in the pilot Genesis 2, produced and written by Gene Roddenberry, also on Law and Order SVU. She made her film debut in Ride the High Country and won the 1963 BAFTA for Most Promising Newcomer. She was also in films like Marnie, The Magnificent Seven Ride, and Encino Man. But for someone my age, and maybe someone like your age too, Steve, many people know her from the Polaroid commercials that she did with James Garner back in the late 70s and early 80s. And Adam is shaking his head. Yep, he remembers those commercials too.
Fabulous. They were terrific together. They were really, really good. A great ad campaign.
What was your take on Mariette Hartley's performance in this particular episode, especially the scenes with your father, the chemistry that they had?
Well, I think she's adorable. I mean, she's just a beautiful woman, but she has a sweet innocence to her that really appeals to me. And I thought she played it so well. She was just in such an awe of the character of Spock. The way I think a lot of us felt when we first saw Spock. He's just, you're kind of like drawn to him immediately because he's so different and so interesting. I love the chemistry between them. I think it really works. I really do. I think she was just a wonderful choice to play against Dad. I mean, I have to share a brief story that I had with my dad, because when we were making the For the Love of Spock documentary, I was talking to him a lot about some of the specifics of each episode. And he would say to me, don't ask me any questions specific to an episode because we made so many shows so quickly. It's all a complete blur to me.
Yeah.
And I said to my dad, well, wait a minute. Are you telling me that you don't remember kissing Jill Ireland in a field of flowers or being stuck in an ice cave with Mariette Hartley? And my dad said, it was a blur, I tell you, a blur. And I just thought that was so funny. I mean, because I this is really a high point for Spock's character. I mean, there's more that I think could have been developed at the time in some of the scene work and some of the internal struggle that we see earlier on with Spock about letting his emotions take over. I know he's back in time by 5,000 years. McCoy doesn't suffer the same malady of being back in time 5,000 years. It's not, regress to some brute state. But I just believe that this was a wonderful moment for his character. And I think that the chemistry is so good between them, and she is just so good. She really has the chops, frankly.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
Because she has this kind of smoldering, beautiful facade, but she's still very charming and sweet and innocent. And just there's just something so genuine about her.
Steve, I have a question for you. So back when we covered City on the Edge of Forever, we were talking about how we didn't even meet Edith Keeler until the middle of the second act, but yet there was still enough time there for that and the rest of the episode for you to buy into this building relationship between Edith and Kirk, and you bought it and it worked, and you really felt the attraction and the love that they shared, or at least maybe not the love, but the common bond, that they spoke the same language. How do you feel now that we're meeting Zarabeth in the middle of the second act? How do you feel about the progression of her relationship with Spock? Is it as believable in Our Yesterdays as it was for Kirk and Edith in City on the Edge of Forever?
I think they're different situations, frankly. And I think, first of all, by the way, I mean, to say that there are lots of beautiful women in Star Trek, the original series, is sort of a ridiculous statement. But there's something about Mariette Hartley that is really just stunning and captivating, both in her appearance and in her performance. I think that the thing that's different is that in both City on the Edge of Forever and the Paradise Syndrome for Kirk, there's actually more time that's passing. They're on the planet in the past over a week, where he's seeing her every day, even though that's off camera. So that's part of what makes that relationship more believable. I think with this situation, it's not as much about this is Spock's soulmate as it is about the transformation that he is going through because of going back in time. It's that's a huge part of it. And so it totally works for me. It's not the same situation of I found the perfect relationship for Spock. That's not exactly how I feel.
Well, I think that the other thing to point out with the reason that why the relationship between Spock and Zarabeth works is not so much because they're professing their love for each other, but it's they're professing their common bond of loneliness.
Yes. Yeah, great point.
Zarabeth is obviously lonely. She's stuck in the past. And Spock is lonely in a completely different way, but it is they're speaking the same language of that loneliness. And that is why I bought into this. And Steve, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole idea that they have 3.5 hours to get the Enterprise out of there before the sun goes nova. Whereas in the episodes you're mentioning, you're talking about days or even weeks, or in the case of the Paradise Syndrome, 6 months. You only have like 3 hours, and you're telling me that Spock and Zarabeth have this like really meaningful bond and this meaningful relationship in such a short period of time? Well, yes. And the reason for that is because of that bond of loneliness.
And the first moment is her just being sort of fascinated by looking at Spock.
What are you called?
I'm called Spock.
Even your name is strange.
And then she asked this really interesting question. She says, "Are you prisoners too?"
Prisoners?
This is one of the places Zorkon sends people when he wants them to disappear.
So this is what we find out, is that she, in fact, this is her prison that she's been sent to.
I am not from the world you know at all. My home is a planet millions of light years away.
And her first reaction is to go, how wonderful. Because she read science fiction books, it sounds like, and loved those ideas. And then her reaction is really interesting, which is she goes,
but they are only stories. Isn't real. I must be imagining all this.
And she starts to panic.
I'm going mad.
And I think, Adam, your dad's performance when he grabs her is fantastic. It's one of my favorite Spock moments.
Listen to me. I am firmly convinced that I do exist. I am substantial. You are not imagining this.
I think if Spock said that to me and I was having some kind of a, let's say, bad trip, I think he would get me back on track.
Yeah, I think it's a great moment for Spock. That she starts to freak out and panic. That it's really great where we see, it's the whole thing about the Prime Directive that we've seen in later Star Trek incarnations, where he's revealing to her something that the planet has not been exposed to. They don't know about intergalactic travel. And I think she's kind of reacting appropriately, even though, again, she sees this alien-looking guy, and it's like, well, where the hell did he come from? When she says, "Are you prisoners too?" It's like as if to say he's from the same planet that she's from. More, I think, could have been made of the fact that Spock is Spock, and he's different from other humanoid, beings. I agree, Steve. It's a beautiful moment when he tries to go to rescue her, to save her from herself.
Okay, one thing I want to point out. First, I agree with both of you on this, but one of the things I really love about All Our Yesterdays, it's not just Leonard's performance, but it's the slow progression of Leonard's performance as he goes from being super logical to maybe not so logical, to being the savage that he was 5,000 years before. So my question is, when Spock grabs Zarabeth and he's like, "Don't worry, I'm real. I am substantial. You're not imagining this." He's pretty aggressive with his reassurance to Zarabeth that he is real. So through that aggression, are we already starting to see the effects of Spock's regression back to his savage time?
I think absolutely. And I think the even more telling thing is that after this moment, he continues holding her hands longer than I think purely logical Spock would have.
Exactly my point. He keeps holding her hands, and that is a very, very telling moment to that this like sort of instant sort of attraction that he has but can't say. So my next question is this: so Spock is still holding Zarabeth's hands, and he looks back at McCoy, who is unconscious from the ravages of the weather. So Zarabeth looks at Spock and says,
"Is he dying?"
Is she already kind of hoping that he does die? So she'll have this handsome, exciting stranger all to herself?
You're so cynical, Scott.
I never thought about that until I was watching it the other day.
I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is if I am totally all alone, 2 dudes showing up is better than 1 dude showing up. I'd want both of them to stay alive.
Okay,
At least
fair
until
enough.
I find out which one's a jerk. And then maybe I want one out of the way.
Yeah,
I think she's too sweet and innocent to go that route. I don't think that's a part of her objective at all. Although I agree with you. It was kind of a weird reading of the line in which there was like a little glimmer of hope that he might disappear from the scene and uncomplicate things for them.
Exactly.
I have trouble with that because I think she's so sincere. She's so genuine. She's so kind-hearted. But then again, we never see her tending to McCoy or helping with McCoy or paying any attention to him really whatsoever.
Well, let me ask you a question, Scott, since you brought this up. Is Zara Beth a good person?
I think she is a good person. I think that she is accepted all this time her fate. And then she sees these 2 people show up. And I think there is something inside of her that we see that she is hoping that they will stay, or at least one of them will stay. And she's not being malicious. She's not being calculating. She's just saying, oh, well, maybe they too went through the Atavachron, and maybe they'll be stuck here with me. She's not being devious. I think that she is a good person because ultimately she does succumb and say, look, I just know that I can't go back. Because if she was being malicious, if she was a bad person, she'd be like, nope, you guys are stuck here.
I've always thought that she was a good person in a terrible situation. That's how I always interpret her character.
Yeah.
We're back with Kirk. He's in jail. And after some henchmen shows up, in comes the prosecutor to come and talk with him.
The prosecutor is played by Kermit Murdoch, who was on TV shows like The Defenders, The Doctors and the Nurses, and The Edge of Night. And in film, Steve, he was in the Heat of the Night and The Andromeda Strain. And there's also the constable, played by Johnny Hamer, who was on TV shows like The Wild Wild West, Gunsmoke, and MASH. He was a voiceover actor who did shows like Plastic Man, Spider-Man, and His Amazing Friends. And on film, he was in Annie Hall, Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, and Injustice for All. You're out of order. Gotta say it.
And you deny being her accomplice?
Yes, I deny it. I was reading in the library when I heard her scream.
I love this moment. Every time I watch this episode, this part, even though the drama with Spock and McCoy definitely gets much, much deeper and greater, this moment when Kirk just says, I was reading in the library when I heard her scream, the look on the prosecutor's face and the way the camera zooms in on the prosecutor like that, it's like, oh, he's from the future too. And just that shift in his tone, in his demeanor, he starts saying,
perhaps your part in this is innocent.
He's a witch! You heard the voices?
It's truth, my lord. I heard the spirit talk to him. He answered, and did call it Bones.
You're a witch!
I always liked that they called one of them Bones line. I always thought that was fun.
And Shatner plays this great. He plays this great because of the desperation that you hear in his voice as Kirk.
What he heard, my lord, were only my friends behind the wall.
And he pauses and he goes,
in the library.
And he says it again to try and get that reaction from the prosecutor. He goes,
in the library.
I know nothing of this. Send for someone learned in witchcraft and let him examine him. I will have nothing to do with it.
I love that the prosecutor lets down his guard to kind of, okay, well, clearly this person is also from the future just like me, and try and get him off the hook. But he's got other people in the room with him who all the prosecutor needs to do is show any sign of weakness whatsoever, and he's outed. He might even be accused of being a witch if he sides with Kirk.
And Kirk is yelling out about Mr. Agtaz, and then we go back to this woman who looks at him and says,
Witch! 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 It'll burn ya!
So the way she turns, witch, 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 they'll ban ya. Like, is she over the top? Absolutely. Does it give me the chills when she does that? Every single time, yes. No, Adam, you're shaking your head. You're thinking she's over the top.
Yeah, Scott, I liked your performance of that whole scene better than I
did
actually
too.
liked the scene.
I did too. When they do the remaster, Scott, we're putting you in.
I'm so not emotionally involved in this story. I really am not. I
See,
just don't care that
I
much.
am. I feel like it's not just about Kirk getting back to the future. It's he's got to get back to the future, save Spock and McCoy, and get the hell out of there with just a couple hours left to go. I'm feeling that desperation because of the desperation that Kirk tries to convince the prosecutor, the way he's like, oh, the library, right? And he's like, by this point, the prosecutor is like, nope, I'm done with you.
Everything you say is true, and I understand why those things should be dramatic. There is like a weird alchemy in film sometimes where I could see all the beats you're talking about. I'm not emotionally involved in it for me.
I get it. I hear you. I respect you to pieces, buddy boy.
We're back in Act 3, and we're back with McCoy, who's groggily waking up.
What about Jim?
Doctor, you're in no condition to get up. You lie down and rest. I shall attempt to find the captain.
You find him, Spock. Don't you worry about me. You do just fine now.
And Zarabeth asks who Jim is. And I do like that he says,
he's our commanding officer and our friend.
I love that moment.
It's so interesting because, we've talked about it through this whole thing, Scott, but I don't think they planned to have this character evolve in the way that he did. But this is not the same guy from The Naked Time, This is a guy comfortable calling this his friend.
Because of the where this episode is, because of the star date, the first number in the star date is a 5. And I always reasoned that even though the show was only on for 3 years, the first number delineates which year of the 5-year mission they're actually on. So because the first number in the star date is a 5, this is actually the 5th year of the 5-year mission, and it's 5/9 something. So it's towards the end of the 5-year mission. I'm such a nerd.
That's true. You're not going to get an argument from me.
Scott, why would they do that if they were hoping to go another couple seasons?
Well, my friend, because they knew that it was not looking good.
I don't think they put this thought into any of that, actually. But Spock asks Zarabeth to help him find the portal, and she goes, but your friend's ill. And then we watch Mr. Spock go into like a complete logic collapse. It's kind of fascinating to watch.
It's still subtle, too.
If I leave him, there's a chance he may never regain the ship. He would then be marooned in this time period. But he is no longer in danger of death. So my primary duty to him has been discharged. And if I remain here, no one of our party would be able to aid Captain Kirk.
And I love what she says. She says,
You make it sound like an equation.
Well, it should be an equation. I should be able to resolve this problem logically.
And what is it about Spock's reaction there? You know what that reaction is? It is an emotional reaction. Like, I should be able to solve this problem logically. Again, you're seeing a gradual shift to another level, bringing Spock to the point where Vulcans were at this point 5,000 years ago. Like, what's your take on your father's like gradual progression in these moments, Adam?
Well, I love it. I think he's, it's very thoughtful. These are, kind of the whole emotional arc for Spock is very carefully thought out. I think he tries to be consistent in terms of what the dialogue calls for. I think he does a terrific job, actually, of the whole emotional arc for that particular episode. The thing that's missing for me is a little more internal turmoil of the fact that he himself is going a little crazy and losing his mind, much like Zarabeth was. The other thing is you have to understand that is kind of a continuing problem with the show, and that is that there are a number of episodes that are shot very quickly in 6 days where there's not a lot of coverage. That is, there's not a whole lot of close-ups. They're wider shots. They're master shots. There's just not that much. You see a number of shots in this episode where they're just wide shots, and even Zarabeth plays towards camera. You see her face looking away from from Spock, or you see McCoy while he's lying down looking towards camera because they don't come around and cover him. These are moments where, coverage and getting close-ups is when you can really get into the emotional inner state of a character. They don't have it. They just don't. They don't have the time, and they don't have the film.
Yeah.
I think these are kind of missed moments. We see these periodically throughout the series where they push in on Spock. They do like Doomsday Machine, close up on Spock, looking at his reaction or non-reaction, to the Commodore's insistence on taking over the Enterprise. These kind of things. These are missing, and I think my dad does the best he can with what he has to work with, and I think he does. I'm biased, obviously, but I love the character. I think he's terrific in it.
First of all, just something that you had mentioned earlier, Adam, of just the concept of you've gone back 5,000 years and therefore you're reverting to that thing. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's so logically inconsistent. It's inconsistent with McCoy. The phaser versus the medical equipment is inconsistent. I don't think that works. But where it gets us to, I really, really like. And I do wish there was just a little more. Spock has this moment, but then he never thinks about this moment again. And this goes to just the idea of why would going back 5,000 years have this effect on him? What we see throughout Star Trek is Spock have this incredible willpower to keep in control of his emotions and think things through logically. And like, well, what's happened here? Like it doesn't really make sense to me, despite the fact that Nimoy's great and the scenes totally work.
Yeah, along those lines, Steve, you have to understand that 5,000 years of evolution of any species is nothing. It's a speck of time. I mean,
agreed.
We have human history beginning 5,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. Now you're talking. I mean, when you talk about human evolution, that took about 6 million years, we estimate. Then 5,000 isn't really significant enough to cause that kind of evolution in the species of Vulcans. It just doesn't make sense.
Also, the whole concept of an ice age happening only 5,000 years ago, maybe, like you said, Adam, maybe 500,000 years ago, but
no.
In terms of geologic time, we had ice ages, 15, 20,000 years ago. That makes more sense to me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But the evolution of the species, that takes a little longer.
Well, it also sort of violates, I think, what we were saying about what happened on Vulcan. It's not that 5,000 years ago when they had wars and conflicts that the Vulcans evolved. They didn't change physically. Nothing in their bodies changed. They learned an important lesson and learned how to use logic to overcome all those passions. It's not that those passions went away. It's that they learned to control them. But but like I said, totally works for me in the scene.
Sorry, Beth. We must return to Mr. Atars and the Atavachron. We will carry Dr. McCoy, and you must come with us.
I can't go through the portal again. If I do, I will die.
You cannot go back.
None of us can go back.
And what does she do when she responds to Spock's comment? She looks away. She can't look him in the eye. And that moment is where her selfishness is kicking in. Again, does not make her a bad person, a malicious person, certainly lonely. And here is somebody to solve that loneliness.
Does she know? There's different possibilities. One is that she believes, she's pretty sure they were prepared by the Atavachron, so they can't go back. Another possibility is she knows for certain they weren't prepared by the Atavachron and they could go back. And the third possibility is she's not really sure.
Well, doesn't Spock say we didn't come here as prisoners?
He does say that, sure.
So,
but he doesn't say we just were in the library, randomly ran through the door. He doesn't say it that way.
Right. So I'm thinking that, well, she's not quite sure that they didn't go through the Atavachron. She's not exactly, she doesn't know for sure, but she knows for sure that they're there. She doesn't know if it's permanent through the Atavachron or they weren't prepared in that way. That one she's not sure about. So she's going with the assumption, sorry, you're stuck here, because that satisfies her needs.
Yeah, Scott, I tend to agree that this is one of those kind of gray areas where it's unclear as to what her intention is, but it's quite possible that she's exaggerating by turning away is indicative of that. She can't look him in the eye. And she's just extrapolating that nobody can go back because we're all stuck here, and you should just resign yourself to the fact that we're going to be together forever.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the thing, by the way, which is the prosecutor later says if you haven't been prepared by the Atavachron, you're going to die in a couple hours.
Right.
So if now I don't know if she knows that, because who knows what was going on when Zorkon was the tyrant, and who knows what she knows. But if she knows that, keeping them there isn't going to do her much good anyway. McCoy wakes up, asks where they are. He's kind of trying to figure out what's going on, and he asks, why aren't you looking for Jim?
It is impossible to look for him, Doctor. We cannot go back.
What do you mean impossible? We've got to get back.
And he gives the information that there's about their cellular structures being changed, and if we return, we'll all die.
Are you trying to tell me that we're trapped here?
Yes, Doctor. We are trapped. Just as Jim is trapped wherever he is.
And the lighting on McCoy at that moment. McCoy is lying down, and the shadow on him, the lighting on him with all the shadow, felt very Jerry Finnerman to me. The lighting on all the scenes in the Ice Age stuff is fantastic. And I'd say actually even the Charles II stuff, the lighting is also really, really good.
So Scott, it's very clear that you hacked into my computer and looked at my notes, because literally right after that line, my note is lighting is great. So clearly we're on the same page.
You guys have not mentioned any of the makeup work that was done in this episode, because if you recall, when they come in out of the cold, Spock is pretty frosty.
Yeah,
even his ears look like they have a little frostbite going on. They're discolored.
That's actually a really great point, Adam. I mean, the way that the frozen look is on McCoy versus the way the frozen look is on Spock. You're right. It's like you ever look at your hands when you're out in the cold for a really long time, your fingertips are a different color than the rest of your fingers or your palms. And the way that Spock is near frozen, the tips of his ears look very different from the coloring of the rest of his ears. So that's a great point.
Gee, thanks, guy.
We're back in jail with Kirk, and in comes this guy with a bucket to give him some food. And Kirk does a little dodge with the cup and pulls him in, and now's got him in some kind of armbar, gets him to unlock the door, and takes him out with the old karate chop.
Okay, so now this moment, we are back in Kirk's time, and we hear Kirk give a captain's log, stardate 5943.9. And that's when I had a revelation. I had an epiphany. So, Adam, you pointed out at the top of this conversation, boy, it's really a shame that this wasn't the last episode, that all our yesterdays didn't close out the original series on a high, that we still had one more episode to go with Turnabout Intruder, which I have to say is not as bad as I remember it, but it's certainly not a great episode. But then it hit me. Wait a minute. The stardate. What is it about the stardate 5943.9 that is really sticking out in my head? Well, All Our Yesterdays was the second to the last episode that was filmed. All Our Yesterdays is the second to the last episode that aired. But what is it about the stardate? And then it hit me. Steve, remember that epiphany I had about Chekhov actually being on the Enterprise in the first season, even though we didn't see him because of the stardate in Catspaw? Well,
yes, I do.
If you put the original series in chronological order by stardate, then All Our Yesterdays is, in fact, the final voyage of the Starship Enterprise in the original series, because that stardate is the most recent or the latest stardate of any that Kirk ever used. So for everyone listening, for everyone who says, oh, too bad, though, they should have ended All Our Yesterdays on the, or should have ended Star Trek with All Our Yesterdays, which I completely agree on, especially that last moment with the Enterprise speeding away from the Nova. Guess what, folks? You got your wish, because chronologically speaking, All Our Yesterdays is the final voyage of the original series Starship Enterprise.
You know what, Scott? I think this nerdy stuff is really paying off for you. I think you got a real future here.
What is the stardate for Turnabout Intruder?
It's before this. I don't know the exact number, but this is the most recent stardate.
Scott, you're amazing. This is why, the Keeper of the Flame. This is why you get that title. The avid Star Trek fans need guys like you to keep track of this kind of thing.
Well, it's a badge of honor, and I wear it with pride.
So after taking out this guard, the prosecutor comes down, and Kirk says to him,
I'm being falsely accused. You know that.
And the prosecutor's just trying to stay in character, but also give him a hint that he's can maybe help get him off.
You will come with me before the Inquisitional Tribunal. There the matter of your witchcraft will be decided. There are no such things as witches.
And then the prosecutor screams, like, so everyone will hear him. He goes,
There are witches! There are!
This is where, by the way, and this, I really wish I knew more about this time travel process. Like, what prepared him to come here? Did he come here with some money? Did he come here with already having a position? Like, how did they do all this? I'd be really fascinated to know. But it's really not stuff that's in the episode.
Help me return to the library. I've lost my way. I must get back there. You cannot get back.
And he tells him the same thing that Zarabeth said, which is that their cell structures will be changed. If they go back, he'll die. And Kirk says,
Prepared? I was not prepared. Your Mr. Atos did not prepare me in any way. Then you must get back at once. If you were not transformed, you can only survive for a few hours here in the past.
So they head out, and now we're back with Zarabeth, and McCoy's doing a little McCoy flirting.
Zarabeth, you are a beautiful cook. Have you ever been told that?
Not recently.
Oh, well, you'll find that Spock is quite delinquent in those matters.
I hadn't noticed it.
and McCoy goes, oh.
What's McCoy figuring out? Like, what's he seeing here?
That's a great question. I think McCoy is seeing already a deficiency in Spock's character. Like, really? Spock is being attentive to you? He's like, oh, interesting. Okay. And then as the conversation goes on, and when McCoy says,
well, now that I'm feeling better, you'll notice a distinct difference in our approach. Really?
Really, really soft, but there's jealousy there, which is also something that Spock should not be feeling. What's your take on the way this scene kind of plays out, this building, simmering boil between Spock and McCoy? This is a peak moment here.
I love it, and I wish I had more of it. I love watching Spock not respond the way that McCoy thinks he will, Zarabeth not respond to McCoy and Spock the way that McCoy thinks that they will, and McCoy watching Spock. I love all of it. I think it's all really interesting.
Well, I think this is probably the first situation in which we have the two of them interested in the same woman. So it's an interesting dynamic. It is groundbreaking, I think, for Star Trek. I mean, we have seen McCoy in his own flirtations. And so I think there is some suspect going on with McCoy that there might be something amiss with Spock. This is unusual for him, for McCoy to witness this kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that he would rib Spock for, the fact that he would be completely unemotional, detached when they're stuck in a cave with a beautiful woman. So I think it has to, I think D. Kelley plays it well, that it does kind of raise his interest that Spock is not reacting the way he would have presumed he otherwise would have.
One of the things that always struck me, and it definitely struck me again rewatching it, is that when Zarabeth walks away, Spock walks away from McCoy and has his back from McCoy. He has his back to McCoy.
I wonder where Jim is.
Who knows? We can only hope that he's well wherever he is.
What do you mean we can only hope? Haven't you done anything about it?
And Spock is getting irritated. He's getting irritated more than usual, okay? Or I would say in a different way with McCoy.
We've been through all that, Doctor. What's the point of rehashing that subject? We can't get back. Wasn't that clear to you?
Yes, that was clear to me.
Then perhaps you were too ill to understand what can't get back means.
And the way McCoy is like, I get it. You want to stay here. In fact, you're highly motivated to stay here in this godforsaken waste. And then Spock turns his back to McCoy again and says,
The prospect appeared quite attractive to you a moment ago.
And then McCoy just lays it on in typical McCoy fashion.
You listen to me, you pointed-eared Vulcan.
Wow. Okay. Wow. At that moment, 3 years of the original series, this entire arc of their relationship, all of the tensions between them, from the Galileo 7 to, of course, the jail cell scene in Bread and Circuses, to This Side of Paradise and the Tholium Web, all of the tensions building between them reaches this boil where Spock has had enough and he can just let it loose on McCoy. He lifts him up.
I don't like that. I don't think I ever did, and now I'm sure.
And McCoy is just like in shock. He's like, what's happening to you, Spock?
Nothing that shouldn't have happened long ago.
Now, Spock is alluding to like all the BS that McCoy's put him through over these years. But that is where McCoy, not Spock in this episode. Spock is usually the one who figures things out, but it's McCoy in this episode who figures it out. He says, long ago, of course, long ago. What a scene. See, Steve, like, and all the great confrontations, the moments, the intimacy that we've seen between Spock and McCoy over these years. What is your take on this moment? Where does this sort of hit you in the chronology of their relationship?
First of all, I think it's a great scene. And in particular, you know, Leonard Nimoy's performance is just great. I mean, just really, really great. What's weird to me, first is that I think what they're saying is it's not, most of the time we see Spock struggling, fighting with his internal conflicts and trying to dominate them. And what it seems like they're saying in this is, no, he's just been transformed. He is now a different person. And that different person, because McCoy is 100% right. The idea that Spock just heard her say, no, you can't go back. And now he's completely given up, not only on him and McCoy, but on Jim as well, is totally out of character. It's just completely out of character. But then this moment of him calling him, you pointed-eared Vulcan. Now, I know that, you know, our relationship to quote unquote racial slurs in 2022 is very different from what we would feel about them in 1968. But the fact that McCoy has continually insulted Spock's species, his race, his planet over and over again, I am totally with Spock in this moment. I think, and I love the line, I don't like that. I don't think I ever did. And now I'm sure.
Wow.
I love that line. And I would hope that, and I wonder too now, because, you know, the movies and the TV show, the animated show and the movies are coming up next, is does McCoy pull those things back, or does he continue to call him horrible things? Because that should make you go like, oh, the dude has never liked me saying this stuff. Because I think McCoy thinks it's all sort of friendly banter, but clearly it's not. This is something that Spock has genuinely not liked. And then also just the scariness of Spock in this moment as a person you don't mess with. I think it's a great scene.
Adam, what's your take?
Well, Scott, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you being the Star Trek geek aficionado among the three of us, there is the scene, we actually had a clip of it in For the Love of Spock, between Scotty and Spock, where Scotty insults Spock and says, just ship out, you freak.
Right.
And Spock reacts to that, saying that he's irritated with humans and is tired of putting up with them. What episode is that from?
Okay, that's from Day of the Dove, and that is a great point that you're bringing up, because that was another moment where Spock just basically says, I never really liked working with all you humans before. But in that episode, unlike this one where he's affected by the change in his time period, in that episode, they were under the influence of the alien entity that was creating these violent interactions between them. But that was another case where Spock wasn't quite himself because he was being affected by this alien energy that was feeding off of hatred and violence. But you are right, Adam, to point out that this is not the first time Spock has said, you know what, I don't really like you guys either. So take that. That is an excellent point.
Well, and on the other episode we discussed in the Enterprise incident, he also says, I think honestly, when talking to the Romulan commander about how it's not always that much fun to serve with humans. And it was funny, you know what just occurred to me is an episode we just did, which is The Savage Curtain, has this moment with Uhura and Lincoln where she says, hey, we've evolved past the point of getting upset about the words people call us. And now we have this moment where it's like, no, we still can get upset about the words that people call us. I think it's a great scene. Yeah. We're back with Kirk. We're out on the street looking for the spot on the wall. Our prosecutor is still panicking and finally just goes like, I can't be any part of this. And Kirk starts to get dizzy, which I guess means that maybe he was getting sick from being in this time period. And finally, he finds the hole in the wall, and he goes back through into the library.
That is a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Right before Kirk goes through the wall. And by the way, when Kirk is searching for the portal, and again, Shatner plays is really, really great. He looks to his right, and his left hand goes through the portal, and there's an effect that kind of slows it down, and a music sting to sort of accentuate the moment. Like, yep, that's it. There's something chilling about the moment, the way that's very dimly lit. Again, the lighting in this episode is absolutely stellar. And when Kirk puts his hand through and there's that sort of like slow down, almost like a freeze, and the music sting, and the way the prosecutor, instead of being like saying like, best of luck, safe travels, be well, good luck with your life, he just says, I can't wait any longer. And he turns around and he runs away. But then he looks back. He looks back at Kirk to make sure that he's going to be okay. And then he turns around and he continues running away. And then there's that moment, Steve, when, because he was not processed through the Atavachron, he was starting to get faint. And then he goes through and he's back through the portal. This is why I think the Kirk story is actually just as strong as the Spock and McCoy story. He got out of the jail cell. He figured out a way to get back to the library, and he is now back in the library. But wait, it's not over yet. I got to find Spock and McCoy. But first, where is Mr. Atoz?
I just want to point out something, and I would never have pointed this out except for the fact that I have a fellow former film school teacher on the podcast. So I bet, Adam, you've experienced this thing. Scott, you described the moment where Kirk looks away before putting his hand through the fake wall.
Yep.
Something that comes up teaching young directors and would come up over and over again is the director would go, I have a moment where two people like bump into each other. And then they would stage it so you have two people with nothing in their hands looking straight at each other, walk straight into each other and bump into each other. And I would also have to say, like, no, you have to give them a reason to bump into each other. You have to give them they have to be distracted. They have to be looking at their phone. They have to be looking away, other directions. Someone has to call their name. Otherwise, they don't bump into each other. That Kirk looking away allows him to be surprised when his hand goes through the thing. Adam, I see you nodding your head. I'm assuming you've had the same conversation.
All the time. I mean, this is the way you make things seem more real when there's specific circumstances surrounding the event that gives it some kind of an organic feel to it, so that you can so it's believable. That's all.
It's all sorts of little things that make performances in films work that nobody really thinks about until they're there trying to make it happen.
It's you. You're lucky you found your way back here. Now let me process you through the Atavachron.
No.
You know what? Mr. Atoz, he's a hero. I mean, the guy has saved the whole planet.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. He processed everyone through the time portal, which must have taken a really, really long time. Depending on how many people are on side.
He's waiting his own life is at risk, and he's still trying to help save Kirk.
Right.
And finally, Kirk does explain that they're from another planet, and he puts basically one Atoz into a room. He knocks out another Atoz. A third Atoz comes up.
You are evidently a suicidal maniac. I don't understand what you're trying to do, but if you continue, both of us will die, and I, for one, do not wish death.
Oh, and it just occurred to me, this Atoz didn't hear his explanation about being from another planet. That was the replica that he told that to.
Oh, that's
so
a good
this
point.
This guy still thinks that he's, one of them.
I regret what I must now do.
And he pulls out a little weapon.
You don't really want to hurt me, do you? You've been trying to save my life. I realize that. Put that thing away.
Kirk goes out, and that's the end of Act 3. We're back in Act 4 with what looks really now like a couple.
I'm sorry. I know of no way to return you to your own time.
It's not that I wish to return. This is my time now. I've had to face that, but it has been lonely here. Do you know what it's like to be alone? Really alone?
And after a pause, Spock says,
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great moment because that pause is extremely convincing. And she goes, I believe you do. See, that to me, that's the moment that solidifies their bond, that solidifies their relationship, that that makes Zarabeth want Spock to stay and makes Spock to want to stay as well.
You know what just occurred to me?
What?
There's the moment in For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky, where the woman whose name, Scott, I'm sure you remember. What's her name?
Natira of Yanada.
Thank you. Where Natira says,
"You have lived a lonely life."
Yes. Very lonely.
Oh, good point.
And at the end of Requiem for Methuselah, Kirk says,
Very old and lonely man. And a young and lonely man. We put on a pretty poor show, didn't we?
our big three best friends, the three most important relationships they have in the world, are all three deeply lonely people.
No wonder they are all drawn to each other and have maintained such a strong bond. What do you think of that, Adam? That's a great epiphany, Steve.
That is a great epiphany. I think that they all can relate to each other on that level. They're all very dedicated to the mission, to their career, their military career, the space exploration. It's a lonely business, you know. And Spock is the outsider, and it's just Zarabeth. I mean, that's a real moment when you can react to something like that. When she asks Spock if he's ever felt that way, and because we know that this is the entire history of Spock's character, as being the outsider, as being alone, as not having a mate, as as being just something other. And it's why a lot of us can relate to Spock, because a lot of us feel that way in some capacity ourselves. So this is why they really are soulmates in a way. I really believe that they really appreciate each other for this deficiency of being lone figures.
Absolutely agree.
I have an unanswerable question for the two of you.
Uh-oh.
Of these three very lonely men, who's the loneliest?
Spock. I think Spock is the loneliest. I think Spock is the loneliest because he's the fish out of water. He's the Vulcan among the mostly human crew. I think Spock is the loneliest for sure. How many other Vulcans were there on the Enterprise? Adam, what do you think?
Well, I think it's debatable, because the fact of the matter is, I think that Kirk could be arguably the loneliest of the triumvirate, in that he's constantly trying to fill the void with finding another one, going from one woman to the next, trying to fill that void. That's why I love Paradise Syndrome. I think he really does want to settle down and have a family.
Yeah.
Spock, it's a philosophical choice. It's not, it's the way he's been raised. It's the way his childhood went. This is somebody who's kind of not been a social creature, all of his life. Kirk, on the other hand, I think has more. He's all human. It's all human emotion, and I think I think it's arguable that this one girl to the next is just trying to fill in an empty void for himself. I think the guy really does want to settle down. That's why I love Paradise Syndrome.
There's also that moment going back to the naked time, Steve. No beach to walk on.
I love that this went the way that it has, because my answer is McCoy. So we get all three of these answers. And it's funny. So obviously they're all three lonely. For me, like, I think if you were to say which person would do the best where Zarabeth is all alone for the rest of their life, I think Spock is the one who's going to do the best, most in control of his emotions. I think he doesn't feel them in the way that Kirk and McCoy do. I totally agree with you, Adam, about Kirk. There's a huge part of him that wants the beach to walk on and to settle down. But here's the thing about McCoy. Kirk and Spock are best friends, and McCoy is the third best friend. Kirk and Spock have each other. McCoy doesn't have anybody like that. I think in a way, he is more alone on the Enterprise than anybody else. He's there in his lab. I mean, Nurse Chapel is an associate. I don't think they're best. I don't think they're close friends. I think she's his nurse.
They just work together. Yeah. That is really, look at us. 3 different answers. I love it.
Have something to eat, please.
If it pleases you.
This is animal flesh.
One of the small things established about Vulcans that we don't talk about a lot is that they're vegetarians.
Zorkan only left me what was necessary to survive.
But he evidently intended that you continue living.
Yes. He gave me weapons, a shelter, food, everything I needed to live, except companionship.
And Spock says, who's been watching her this whole time, in a way I don't think we've seen Spock watch anybody.
Exactly. When Zarabeth gets up to walk away and Spock is taking the bite out of the meat, he's checking her out. He's watching her.
And you know what? If I were in a cave with Mariette Hartley, I'd
watch her too.
Yeah.
A very inventive mind, that man.
But insensitive to send such a beautiful woman into exile.
Oh, and the look on her face when he says that, she's like surprised, shocked, and thrilled at the same time. And the expression that he has, like, what? Whoa, what did I just say? I'm sorry, excuse me. Something's wrong with me. But you are beautiful. It's a great moment. It's really a great moment. And I have to say about this moment, Spock is well, here's my question for you. Is Spock thinking about his time on Omicron Ceti 3 with Layla Kolomi? Does Spock regret giving up the spores to return to the Enterprise and is now thinking of this moment with Zarabeth, thinking of his second chance to be happy?
100%. I think he's thinking about that. And the other one I was thinking about, not that this was emotionally the same connection, but I think he's thinking about Droxine on the Cloudminders, where he said, I can appreciate a beautiful woman. There's like, I feel like, in the way that we're talking about the show in terms of it evolving over time, is that Spock has been wrestling with these ideas, and that in this side of paradise and the spores opened up a part of him that he wasn't willing to deal with right away, but is continuing to wrestle with it. And then when he compliments that Droxine is beautiful, that's another moment of him. And now here he is. And it's like, am I going to screw up this opportunity again?
Right, right. By the way, I'm impressed that you remember Droxine's name. Very nice.
Every once in a while I'll pull one up, but that was more recent too.
Adam, what's your take on all that? Do you think that there's something to the evolution of Spock having regret over giving up the spores and his love for Layla Kolomi and being happy, and him being, well, it's freezing here and there's not anyone else around, but hey, I got a beautiful woman and we definitely are connecting. I'm not going to mess that up this time.
Well, the thing is that's so interesting is that we have seen unrequited love with Spock repeatedly throughout the 3 seasons. I mean, even in Amok Time, he's supposed to go home and be reunited with his wife, and that goes awry.
Yeah.
We have this side of paradise where when he comes back to his sanity, he sobers up and realizes that it's just not in the cards for him at that point in his life to settle down. Then we have Enterprise incident, where I think he does actually have feelings for the Romulan commander. I mean, they really have a lot of things in common, just from an evolutionary point of view between Romulans and Vulcans. That goes awry. Then we have Droxine, in the Cloudminders. That goes awry. So it's like, when is Spock going to finally get his? And it feels like, when you know that about the character, when you've played those roles, you can bring all that to bear, which I think he does. I mean, again, there's more to explore there. There's more to cover there. Close-ups of his internal struggle would be really, really interesting for this episode. But this is really the culmination of all that. I really believe that it's tough because he's under the influence of this 5,000-year regression issue that we're dealing with, and it's not just Spock wrestling with his human self, his Vulcan self versus his human self. There's this third element involved, which kind of clouds the issue a little bit. But I really do think it's there is some, the fact is the guy is half human. So I really think it's like, maybe this time this is his moment and that he should give into it.
Yep.
And I love his thought process, his voiced thought process at this moment. He says,
"Please pay no attention. I'm not myself. I'm behaving disgracefully. I have eaten animal flesh and I've enjoyed it. What is wrong with me? I tell you, you're beautiful."
And then there's this pause. And then he looks at her and says,
"But you are beautiful. Is it so wrong to tell you so?"
He gives in. He surrenders. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost as if he's saying, look, there's something going on here that's wrong. There's something wrong with me, but this I'm pretty sure is right. that you are who you are.
It's funny. I mentioned probably, I think way back on this side of paradise, that I might have had some experience with certain chemicals that might alter the way you see things. And there are certain moments where you see a truth, like a real truth. And it's like, why not say this? What am I doing not voicing the way that I feel? I've spent all this time not saying things. And Spock's going, well, she is beautiful. I am attracted to her. Why not? What's stopping me? And it's all beautifully lit. It's all beautifully done. And he goes to her and he kisses her and the music is playing and there's more kissing. And he says,
You are beautiful. More beautiful than any dream of beauty I've ever known.
And that line is used on the back cover of photo novel number 6. So,
question.
Yes.
Did Spock get laid?
Hold on to that. I'm going to come back to that at the end of our conversation.
Okay, you got it. And I love how we cut back to the library from this very romantic moment on Kirk on a cart and Atoz is just trying to push him through that damn door.
I think that's a great cut, by the way. That you have this tender moment, and then you cut back to Kirk is coming to, and he realizes that Atoz is going to push him through on the cart, and he just like slides off right at the nick of time, and you see the cart go through. And Kirk is still groggy; he's coming to, and Mr. Atoz is pushing him through the portal. This is a great moment, and you see the portal going, flashing, and the music is really dramatic. And Kirk finally overpowers Mr. Atoz, puts him in a headlock, and while he's in a headlock, he calls the Enterprise.
Are you ready to warp out?
Aye, Captain.
Stand by to beam us up. But when that star explodes, don't wait. Get out fast. Kirk out.
I mean, if there's so much drama going on here, like all the, it took a while, a little bit at the beginning of the episode for it to kick in, but now we're really going like it's like really a nick of time moment, a situation here, which has provided some of the best dramatic moments we've seen in the original series.
And finally, he convinces Atoz to help him look. And they go to look. And one thing I was thinking is like, well, if it is that it's just that McCoy was looking at that particular disc on the viewer, and that's why when they went through, they went to the Ice Age, wouldn't that disc still be just sitting there on the viewer? Like, why does it take a while to find? But of course it does. We're back in the Ice Age, and Spock and Zarabeth are kind of having a little moment. And McCoy says,
You've been dishonest with me, Spock.
I've given you the facts, Doctor.
The facts as you know them. Or did you just accept Zarabeth's word because it's what you wanted to believe?
You were told the truth. If Zarabeth is the source, what difference does it make?
Zarabeth is a woman, condemned to a terrible life of loneliness. She would do anything to anybody to change that.
McCoy's not messing around at this point, I think.
No, he's not. And by the way, I have to say, DeForest Kelley is fantastic in this episode. His performance, of all the times that Spock had the upper hand, where McCoy had to even apologize like he did in the Tholian Web. Now McCoy has the upper hand. He's the one being rational.
You said we can't get back. The truth is you can't get back.
She would not jeopardize other lives.
She would do anything to prevent that life of loneliness. She would lie. She would cheat. She would even murder me.
And he grabs her by the hair and she starts to scream. And then Spock jumps up, grabs McCoy by the throat, pushes him against the wall. And DeForest Kelley's delivery here.
Are you trying to kill me, Spock? Is that what you really want?
There's no emotion there. There's no like he's not being like, Spock, are you, like he's not raising his voice. He's like trying to point out to him, wait a minute, Spock, do you realize what you were trying to do? Are you trying to kill me?
To me, it really reminds me of the moment in Space Seed where Khan has the scalpel against his throat and he just recommends, cutting the carotid artery. It's in these moments, McCoy is as brave as anybody else on the Enterprise.
Sure.
What are you feeling? Rage? Jealousy? Have you ever had those feelings before?
Leonard's performance at this moment is great.
This is impossible. Impossible. I'm a Vulcan.
Say what you want about the third season, but all the best of the third season is kind of in this episode in moments like this.
And watching Spock sort of fall apart as he realizes what's happened to him. And finally, McCoy tells him,
Think, man. What's happening on your planet right now is this very moment.
My ancestors are barbarians. Warlike barbarians.
And this is another way that Our Yesterday brings the series almost full circle, is that when did we hear for the first time that Spock's ancestors were savage? In Balance of Terror, in the briefing room, we hear Spock describe the Vulcans, the earlier Vulcans, as being savage, and that this set of Vulcans went off to be logical and the other set went off to be Romulans. But we also hear about it a little bit in Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, when Beale is having basically drinks with Spock and McCoy.
And Spock goes to Zarabeth and asks very sincerely and earnestly,
can we go back?
I don't know. I only know that I can't go back.
And I believe her.
I know I'm gonna try, Spock. Because my life is back there. And I want that life.
And he grabs fur and he heads out into the snow, and we're back with Atoz and Kirk trying to find the right disc.
If we're to get the portal set for the proper time period, you must be specific.
I didn't see it.
Well, try calling out.
Bones! Spock!
And we have Zarabeth and Spock have come out, and they're looking around at the portal like Kirk was looking at the wall to find it. And they're talking about giving it up. And then we hear,
Bones! Spock!
It's Jim. Here we are, Jim.
Yeah, I love that moment too. And Kirk points to Atoz and he goes,
We found them.
like, oh my God, we found them. Like, he's like, holy moly, we lucked out. We actually found them. Okay, come on through, guys. We are out of time. And just the way that Spock drags this out, instead of like being like, okay, see you later, and going through with McCoy, he grabs Zarabeth and he holds her and he holds her face. And like, this is really a beautiful moment. What's your take on your father's performance at this moment with Mariette Hartley, Adam?
I think it's one of the greatest moments in Star Trek history. It's just one of my favorites. It's so beautiful. They look so good together. They're so in love. It's so heartfelt. It's great because they play the moment. I love it in Star Trek when there are these moral dilemmas, there are these emotional dilemmas, and they take the time to let it play out. Again, very little coverage. It's just a 2-shot of them. They have to, work on the timing themselves. They have to be very specific about what it is they're doing in the scene. I think it's a wonderful climax to their relationship and an understanding that this is the final moment for them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Steve, what about you?
It's great. It's very tender. And it is funny. I mean, people have compared this, said this is Spock City on the Edge of Forever. And while this final moment isn't as brutal as that, the sense of loss is very, very similar. And you could see Spock stalling and then goes, go ahead. And if McCoy had gone ahead and if it had worked, would Spock have come after him?
I literally have in my notes, Steve Morris, would Spock have stayed behind? Because at the moment, Spock is stalling and time is running out. You can hear Kirk on the other side in the library saying, come on, let's go. Hurry up. We're running out of time. And McCoy turns around and says, well, come on, Spock, let's go. And Spock pushes McCoy through, but of course he can't get through because he has to go back with Spock. So to answer your question, if Spock had pushed McCoy through and it actually worked, but Spock had stayed behind, yep, absolutely. No questions asked. Adam, what do you think?
I think it would have been the quintessential series cliffhanger, season cliffhanger for us not to know how this all got resolved.
Oh my gosh. Can you imagine if this was actually the last episode and they did have a 4th season? Like, is Leonard going to come back or is he? Oh boy. Wow. Yeah. Good point.
And then we have to slingshot around a sun and go back in time and rescue Spock and Zarabeth. I mean, clearly, based on what's happening in that moment, he totally would have stayed. Yep. I think he 100% would have stayed.
One of the most awkward moments in Star Trek history for me is when he tries to push D. Kelley into a rock.
Yeah.
And he doesn't transport back by himself.
They realize they have to go through together. We see Zarabeth let go of Spock's hand and turn and walk away in one of what I think might be one of the most beautiful shots of the 3rd season of her walking away into the snow. It's just gorgeous.
The way that she walks away and then Mariette Hartley turns back around and the camera holds on Zarabeth and she's got a tear running down her face. And the camera holds on her as the wind is blowing her hair is just one of the most exquisite and beautiful moments of the original series because of the way it gives her that final moment of heartbreak to watch as she lets go. You love something. What is one of the best expressions of love is letting something go, and she really did love him.
I was going to say that, Scott. I think it's the ultimate act of love to sacrifice the person that you love so much, knowing that it's for their benefit. And I think she plays it beautifully. I think it's just, that's the thing about Star Trek that I just adore is that they hit on themes that we have been going through, we've been experiencing for storytelling for thousands of years, and they are able to hit on it right on the head and hit us emotionally with it and show us another take on it. And I think it's one of the greatest shots, the way she's backlit, the way her tear, her looking back longingly for Spock. I think it's one of the greatest moments in television history.
For sure. Steve.
I agree. I concur with everything you just said. They come back through, and I love that the moment they get through, Atos grabs his disc, and he is out of there.
He had his escape planned. I'm glad he made it.
And then Kirk's total lack of hurry at this moment doesn't really make sense to me when we're, seconds away from his son blowing up. But we do get this great, great moment with McCoy studying Spock, and Spock says,
"There's no further need to observe me, Doctor. As you can see, I've returned to the present in every sense."
What is Spock feeling as he says, "I return to the present in every sense"? What does that feel like for him emotionally?
I'm glad you asked. I was going to make this point, but you were on the same page as usual, Steve. I think he is thinking, again, for the second time in my life, I was happy. And now I lost it again. I lost it again. She's dead and buried long ago. And he's maybe trying to rationalize it by saying it's in the past. And it is in the past. Really, I mean, it's in the past. But he felt that moment of happiness that he had not felt since Omicron Ceti 3, where he was able to, well, in that case, he had the spores. In this case, it was just a time thing. But he was happy. He felt a connection. And now he lost it again. It is the tragedy that these three characters we've all pointed out separately, saying, "Oh no, McCoy was the loneliest one. No, Kirk was. No, it was Spock." And that line that you've often quoted, Steve, from Star Trek V, of all places, that we need our pain. We need our pain. And it is a tragic moment for Spock that he again lost that happiness. And this brings this episode back to a first season classic, that he was happy then and he lost it. And then now, again, by choice, he lost his happiness a second time.
It's an interesting question, Steve, because I think Spock realizes once again that when he was not himself, that he really felt he was able to let go of his emotions. He was able to let the logical side of him subside a little bit and really feel what it's like to be human and what it's like to have love for another person. And I think that's maybe what's happening to him when he comes back out of it. It's like, you don't have to worry, Doctor. I'm back to myself, and it's not necessarily a great thing for him. It's a kind of a realization that it's a little bit of a lonely and sad existence. And yeah, to your point, Scott, I think this is exactly the same as that push-in moment at this side of paradise when they ask what he thinks of the experience, and he says, "For the first time in my life, I was happy." And it's just it just hits you so hard emotionally. It's you just, again, we've gone through such a journey with Spock. We've known him for so long. We know of the struggle that he's had. And yet here again, he's finding himself in the same position, which is, lost love, unrequited love, that was so close, that was in his grasp. It was so close for him, and now it's gone.
Steve.
So I think that often your greatest attributes can also be your greatest weaknesses. that they're frequently opposite sides of the same coin. And what I find so interesting about this is it's not that emotional control came easily to Spock. You know, as someone, I don't think it comes easily to any Vulcan. It's clearly a discipline that has to be worked at. And the fact that he's half human means that he's worked much, much harder to maintain this thing. And that effort, that work has made him the Spock that's been able to be the hero over and over and over again, because he doesn't get lost in the emotional stuff. He can focus on what is the real problem and not be distracted by biases or his opinion or his emotional reactions. So that's this great strength. But then that strength ends up being a cause for pain, because the discipline required to get him to this place is the thing that makes him not capable of experiencing these emotions. And as a person, you know, I said, I often feel very Spock-like. I don't tend to, and you could ask the people that know me best, tend to react emotionally to emotional, stressful situations. I tend to be very calm. And that, if you're directing a movie and a huge disaster has happened, which happens in every movie, I'm the guy who's not going to freak out about it because I'm very calm. But I'm also not always very in touch with my emotions, or being, you know, I'm like Scott, I marvel at you having this enthusiastic reaction as you passionately explain how you felt in this moment. I don't have that reaction, you know, like I don't have that. And so this thing that is this skill of mine to be able to be detached also is this thing that is sad, you know, because I don't get to feel that way. And it's funny, I realized that in a lot of ways I've surrounded myself with friends who do have strong emotional reactions, because there's this weird vicarious enjoyment I get from, like, sometimes it's guiding someone into something great and watching them have a great experience. And that's the closest I get, is to kind of pull off of their emotional experience. And so I think this moment of, I was right in it. I was right having this deep, profound emotional connection. And now that's gone. And I'm back to being me. And being within the limits that I've created for my own identity. That's rough. It's a rough moment.
Wow, Steve, my heart breaks for you.
I don't know, but I like who I am. You know what I mean? It's a weird.
I like who you are too. I think that's why we make a great team doing Enterprise Incidents and the Cinephiles. I got to say, for everyone who's been listening to our journey on Enterprise Incidents, there have been certain times when an episode didn't quite work for some reason, and Steve Morris would come in with what we like to call the Steve Morris rewrite, and how he would make an episode better. Well, in this case, for All Our Yesterdays, I don't have a whole episode rewrite, but I just have a rewrite of these final moments in All Our Yesterdays, because Steve, like you just pointed out before, when Spock and McCoy come back through, Kirk should have said, okay, we're here, go, beam us up, and we're out of here. And that's not what happens. You have this moment that Spock and McCoy have while they're still on Sarpedon in these final seconds. And then Kirk cuts to, Scotty, are you there? And he goes, you've got to beam aboard now. And Kirk says, beam us up and go to maximum warp as soon as we're there. And then there's that shot of the Enterprise speeding away from Sarpedon as Beta Niobe goes nova and Sarpedon disintegrates. And that is the final shot of Our Yesterdays. It is the final shot chronologically, stardate-wise, of the final voyage of the Starship Enterprise in the original series. But of course, we still have one more episode to go that was filmed. My rewrite would simply have been, let's just say that someone like Mark Daniels had actually directed All Our Yesterdays. Instead, I forgot to mention that the episode was directed by Marvin Chomsky, who had directed And the Children Shall Lead and Day of the Dove, which I love Day of the Dove, and Adam pointed out Day of the Dove before. But if Mark Daniels had directed it, I think the scene would have played out that Spock and McCoy come back through the time portal. And then, like Steve pointed out, Ataz pushes Kirk out of the way. He jumps through the time portal. Kirk calls the Enterprise, says, Scotty, emergency beam up, go to maximum warp. And then you see them beam up. You see the effect of them beaming up, and then you see the Enterprise speed away from Sarpedon, and the Beta Niobe goes nova, and then they're on the platform in the transporter room, and Scotty's at the transporter breathing a sigh of relief, and Kirk steps off the platform, and he's about to go through the door to go back to the bridge, and says, "Are you coming, gentlemen?" And McCoy says to Spock, "In a moment, Jim." And Spock turns to McCoy, and that's when he has that conversation. No need to look at me that way, doctor. And then, going on where she says she is dead and buried long ago. And the episode ends on that moment that Adam pointed out that harkens back to, for the first time in my life, I was happy. And that is when you see the Enterprise speed away from the camera, produced by Fred Freiberger, executive producer Gene Roddenberry. And that is how I would have ended this episode.
That would have been beautiful, Scott. There's only one problem.
What's that?
Company move to stage 9. Not going to happen.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Absolutely.
I bet if we had earlier scripts, I bet it was back on the Enterprise, and that's exactly what happened. Is it was $2,000 to fire up stage 9, and they said we're not going to do it. Because I even think I would add to I love your ending, Scott, and I would add a moment of Spock walking away and Kirk turning to McCoy and asking what's happening,
right?
And McCoy,
right,
says it was something long ago. It's 5, But by the way, I also want to point out that yes,
it happened, but that was 5,000 years ago, and she is dead now, dead and buried long ago.
Those lines I've always found chilling, because just in that one line of Spock's talking about, it was 5,000 years ago, I imagine the next 40, 50 years of Zarabeth's very, very sad and lonely life and her very, very sad and lonely death. And it's upsetting,
Yeah, it's sad.
And the beat you guys are we're all talking about is that moment after Edith is killed by the truck and McCoy says to Kirk, Jim, do you know what you just done? And Spock says, He knows, Doctor.
He knows, Doctor. He knows.
He knows.
Yeah, absolutely. Great parallels there for sure. So, Steve, you mentioned about, did Spock and Zarabeth do it? Well, fan fiction will tell you, yes, they absolutely did do it, because there were 2 novels written. One was called Yesterday's Sun, and the other was called Time for Yesterday. They're both follow-ups to All Our Yesterdays concerning a child that Spock and Zarabeth conceived, and the child's name was Zar. Another thing is that, Steve, as we've talked about, as we're closing out our voyages through the original series, we're moving on to the animated series. And in the very last episode of the animated series, called The Counterclock Incident, where the Enterprise crew members they regress and turn into children, which, Adam, is something that you had experience with on The Next Generation, which I totally thought about when I was watching this episode. Rascals. I was totally thinking about Rascals watching The Counterclock Incident. So Robert April, in the beginning of this episode, acknowledges that Kirk and the Enterprise were present because they're around a star that went nova. And the star was Beta Niobe. And Kirk and Robert April, the first captain of the Enterprise, says, "Oh, you were here when that happened, huh?" So there's some good continuity going on there.
I'm curious, did anybody have anything to say about this episode?
Well, I mentioned that this was the episode that got Star Trek its final Emmy nomination. And John Dwyer, the set decorator, said they had to pick one episode for the Emmy nomination, but it's not really so much for that one episode, it's for the whole show. So when the Academy nominated this episode, they were really nominating the whole season of episodes. Marvin Chomsky, the director, said, "The third one that I directed, the one with the library, I loved that show. A wonderful cast, a marvelous concept." Producer Fred Freiberger said, "I remember when Leonard Nimoy read the script, he came to me and he said, 'I'm a Vulcan. How can I passionately be in love with a woman with human emotion involved?' So I said, this is way back in time before the Vulcans had evolved into a non-emotional society." He took a moment and he accepted that, for which I was very grateful. I love that episode. It's one of my favorites. And then Mariette Hartley says, "My memories of the show are all quite positive. It was wonderful working on that set. Even though it was one of the last scripts shot, there was still a feeling of newness and excitement. I guess it was partly because Spock didn't fall in love every day. Leonard Nimoy is a very serious actor, and this episode gave him a chance to use acting abilities he didn't ordinarily have a chance to display. It's a beautiful story, well written, very well directed. It was a fabulous show, and I echo all of those sentiments perfectly."
So I'll give you what my final thoughts are, which is I honestly am kind of where I was before, which is that the Spock and McCoy scenes with Mariette Hartley are fantastic. There's some of my favorite things in Star Trek, some of my favorite Spock moments in Star Trek. I love how they handle the character, even though I think the setup doesn't entirely make sense. I think it's great. And the other stuff is kind of whatever to me. It's not bad. You know what I mean? It doesn't, we've talked about some terrible episodes of Star Trek in the third season. I don't think it's one of those. It's just totally fine, enjoyable stuff, elevated by the Spock stuff. That's my feelings about All Our Yesterdays.
Adam, what are your feelings about All Our Yesterdays, especially after this conversation?
I think it's a great episode. I think I've said all there is to that I could think of to say about how wonderful it is. I mean, it has a lot of emotional impact on me. It's a real standout. I love Mariette Hartley. I just think she's adorable. She's just beautiful and so kind-hearted and so sincere in this show. I think she's a real challenge for my dad. Look, I mean, you need good talent to bring your A game, and I think she's a real challenge for him, and she just had the acting chops that were required of that part. It could have so easily gone south very quickly with the wrong casting. So I think we got really lucky with our guest star in that episode.
We absolutely did. I've said so much about this episode on this conversation. I've said it on previous conversations just to bring the episode up. Doing this deep dive conversation has actually made me love this episode more because of all the ways that it ties into the chronology of the original series, which is basically what Enterprise Incidents has been all about, has been treating Star Trek like a serialized show. And it really does work because the characters, by the time they got to the end of season 3, they were evolved and very different from the way they were in the beginning of that first season. So with that, for everyone who has been listening to Enterprise Incidents from the very beginning, we have had amazing guests on this series, including Adam Nimoy. Of course, Ralph Sinetsky is one of our favorites. Walter Koenig, Dave Rossi, Laurie Ulster. So many great guests. But to bring this portion of Enterprise Incidents to an almost close with an interview with the man himself, William Shatner, I could not imagine a better way to go out on the original series. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is, just for Enterprise Incidents, William Shatner. And joining us right now, I am so excited to say these words.
What are you going to say?
Welcome aboard Enterprise Incidents, William Shatner. This means the world.
You mean you want to talk to me?
I definitely want to talk to you.
Good.
And what I want to talk to you about, Bill, is your latest book called Boldly Go, which came out on October 4th, 2022. And on October 5th, I went on a plane ride to a film festival in Spain, and I read the entire book on the way to Spain.
No kidding. I've never even done that.
It is fantastic. This book is fantastic.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, Scott, that's delightful to hear.
It is. What I have to say about Boldly Go is I feel like it's volume 2 to your previous book, Live Long and ... because both of these books are very profound. You're very candid about the ups and downs of your life, of what you learned and what you hope other people learn. But why did you feel like the time was right to go further with Boldly Go?
Well, if I remember correctly, I started writing books about, first of all, it was my experience with Star Trek. That's what they were after. Well, what is your experience in Star Trek? So many years ago. And even though it was many years ago that I wrote the first book, I've forgotten the title.
Star Trek Memories.
Star Trek Memories. And but I couldn't remember anything. It was years later, and I don't know whether it's a product of my mind, my aging mind, or just everybody. I couldn't remember exactly what had happened. It's like, there was a guy named Fetterman, and then Leonard Nimoy was there, but I couldn't remember the stories. So I thought, I got to write this book. And I don't know. So I went around to people who were in the show and said, what do you remember And oh yeah, that happened. So I got my memories from other people. So now I'm out of memories. I don't remember anymore, or I can't get anybody to remember something that they don't remember. Then I realized if I was going to write any more books, it had to be about me. And then I thought, I've got 3 children, and they're on the verge then, I guess, or maybe it was, I anticipated that by that time, I anticipated them having children. I'd leave something behind from these grandchildren who wouldn't know me or wouldn't know. So when I was asked to write a book, I would write something about me because it was the only subject I knew. I mean, I'm a college graduate. I've been acting for a long time, but I don't think you can teach acting. I don't remember anything of the subjects that I learned in college. I think I'm well read, but I'm illiterate. I mean, everything about what I could contribute to the literate world is negligible. The only thing I could contribute that was unique was my experiences. And my experiences were my feelings about X, Y, and Z. And then I had this physical experience or emotional experience, and I would try and discern what it was I felt so I could write that into a book. So the only material I have is myself. Now, I read continuously. I mean, if you're not talking to me, I'm reading a book. Like there's been a tragedy in my life. My whole library, I bought a new phone, and my whole library that I had in my phone, in my original phone, is gone.
Oh.
I don't know where it went to, but it must be when they got rid of when they got rid of all the information in my first phone, all that information's gone in my new phone. So I don't have a library. So I bought a book immediately, which was something about the woods, about trees, because that's an ongoing subject that I keep reading about. But I don't know enough about, this guy's written The Heartbeat of Trees, I think it's called. I could look it up. So it's all about trees, and I love this connection. What I look forward to is seeing this incredible connection that humans have with the world around them, because we're part of the world around them. But the uniqueness, the information of how we're connected is esoteric, and not many people know about these incredible. So I've read 3 or 4 books about trees, and I could tell you that trees send electrochemical signals from the mother tree to the baby trees.
Right. That's right.
It takes care of the babies. We knew for a long while that it sent pheromones downwind. Bugs are attacking, other trees would make their sap more acidic. But now we found out, using the mycelia of fungi, it sends electrochemical signals to the trees. There's a brainwave. Our dendrites, our brains are sending electrochemical signals along our dendrites. How similar is that brainwave from tree to tree to in our brain? So that connection is always there. So I know a lot, but not a great deal about trees and their electrochemical signals. My whole library is gone. The first book I bought was a new book by Wallaben, this guy who writes about trees and their life. That's the first book I bought to replace all the books that are gone.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying to you, Scott, is the books I write are about myself because I don't know anything else. So I know what it feels like to feel fear. I know what it is like to lose somebody. I know. So I tell those stories because it's the only stories I know. I don't know enough about trees to write about trees, although I've read innumerable things about trees. I have dogs and horses. I understand dogs and horses, but I don't know enough to write a book about them and I read those books about dogs and horses, and I go, that's really informative, but I don't know enough. So everything I write is what I feel. And what I feel, I don't think it needs to be held as a close closely held secret, because if I feel love, how do I feel love? I'm on the edges of being a poet, and I look to poets. I think, oh God, I wonder if I could do that. So it's being a poet is finding a fresh way of seeing the world that everybody sees, of seeing it and expressing it. So am I a poet if I express what you feel about dirt or fear? So that's why I write. That's why one book seems to be a continuation of the other.
Yeah, it sure does.
Okay?
It sure does.
It's a long way around, but it's also material for the interview. You follow?
Yeah. But in this book and in the last one, Live Long and ... you said something in the last book that really resonated with me, because I thought that is really, really great advice. That's a great words to live by. And I have to tell you how much it actually did enrich my life and reap so many rewards.
What are you going to say?
Say yes to everything.
There you go.
Oh my gosh. I can't tell you how many doors saying yes has opened for me, because even though this door might not be great, the door that opens was awesome.
That's it. So obviously, and I've been criticized for saying that, obviously I don't mean stand on a bridge and say yes to jumping off. I don't mean that.
Yeah.
But if an opportunity that doesn't, upon your intuition and observation, doesn't lead to your dismemberment, why not say at least yes for an exploratory talk? Somebody says, let's go out to dinner, then I got to watch Yellowstone. No, watch Yellowstone later. Go to dinner and get some refreshment from somebody else. Ask people questions. What are they doing? What do they like? And in that refreshment, you refurbish yourself, renew yourself.
In these books that you've written in these last 10 years or so, you've really, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the philosophy that doing Star Trek all those years ago, the compassion, the family, the knowledge, and you are a very curious person, because you ask more questions at these conventions than you get asked by the fans. But did you ever think about how like all that positivity and curiosity of Star Trek has actually rubbed off on you?
Well, I don't know whether it's since you're doing Star Trek, you could say it was Star Trek. But for me, Star Trek was a show. It went on for 3 years. I had 10 pages a day to learn. The people around me were professional. There wasn't this great idea, oh, we're doing a philosophical idea. It was, you got to learn the words and say the words and move on. I don't think it created that curiosity, although I don't remember as a young man, even as a middle-aged man, that I was that curious. I must have been, but I don't remember asking all the questions. But gradually I began to see that the most interesting part of life is people's stories. That's why you've been doing interviews for so long. I mean, everything is of fantastic interest. And I choose the word fantastic because in a way it's a fantasy. Whether it's a story about trees, poor Kathleen. Kathleen, I'm on. Bye-bye. She is the dearest Kathleen Hayes.
She's lovely, lovely.
My God, I just love her to death. So she's so looking after me that even though we're past the time when we would have connected, she's still after me. Are you okay? Okay. You know what I haven't done? You know where it says in your phone an emergency, what number should you? So what number do you have?
Me?
Yeah.
My fiance's.
It's your fiance?
Yes. Jennifer.
Why haven't you married her?
We're working on it. See, you're asking me the questions.
That's the title of one of my books. I'm working on that. Well, the reason I ask, obviously, is a fiance has anticipation of something you're going to do, like a marriage ceremony.
Sure.
But you haven't done it. and for reasons that I don't want to get into in an interview on me. So, but it's a temporary. But I mean, you don't know how temporary that number is. I'm dying. Call my fiance. You know, the fiance answers, "No, I'm sorry. I'm going out with another guy, and I can't answer that call." You don't have anybody to. You don't have anybody to call to.
Yeah.
So I've got my wife down, but and the doctor, and I'm trying to add another number in my phone, and I won't let me. But I would add Kathleen Hayes's number for an emergency, because that's how much I love her, but she loves me. And we've been together 12, 13 years now. And she's like,
I would add Kathleen's number to my phone. That's how awesome she is.
She gets everything done.
Yes.
You know, it's unbelievable. Wonderful. Yeah. So that's by way of saying, who would you, what a definitive question that is. You got an iPhone? You interviewing somebody, yeah? Who have you got down as the person to call in an emergency?
Yep.
I mean, that's your life. That person doesn't answer, or the person doesn't, you know, you could die. I mean, I need, if I'm unconscious in your presence, I need air, okay? I've got apnea. I could die without being intubated. All right? Remember, and your reading audience. Intubate me. Great.
One of the things about these last couple of books, especially with Boldly Go, is you are extremely candid with regards to your successes, which there are many, with all of the detours your career has taken, whether it's music and with directing, but also, you know, the tougher times. You're very candid about the tougher times. Like right after Star Trek was canceled, so, you know, your job had ended, you know, your marriage had ended, and you went through a really, really hard time. When you write about stuff like that, do you find it's like healing, like it's cathartic for you to like put it on paper?
I know that's the cliche. Yeah, I wrote about it now. I don't even know what closure means. What does closure mean? Somebody dies and you bury them. Oh, I got closure. Bullshit. You're thinking about them all the time. You think, God, I just read an article. I read an article just before you and I started talking about a lady whose son, about 15, says to her, "I'm gay." And she says, "Oh, God doesn't want you to be gay." And she tries to stop him from being gay, but he's gay. And after a while, she says, you know, 5 years ago, she said, "Okay, I accept it. You're gay." And but God doesn't like, and he turns to drugs. And then finally, she says, "I accept you in any manner you want." Years later, so he gets off of drugs, but then for some reason he gets back on drugs and dies. And now she's saying, if only I had known, if only I could have accepted whatever my boy is, I love him, and I would have loved him for whatever, and I would have loved his partners. And I'm thinking, that's like terrible. What a regret that is. What a story that is, to live with that regret. So there's no closure there.
Right.
You go, you know, yeah, I got him buried, I got him, and I did a whole article on. Now you don't get closure. Something happens that is terrible in your life. It's part of you. It's part of your sadness, and it's a part of your understanding, and it's a part of your worldliness, because everybody has something happen to them. So closure, there's no such thing. So writing a book doesn't give you closure. It merely describes, for my children,
yeah, sure,
what the event was. And in effect, what I'm doing is writing for my kids who don't read my books.
Well, they will.
Yeah, Daddy's dead. Read a book.
You know, you brought up a name at the top of this conversation, a name I was going to ask you about during this conversation. So
Jerry Finnerman.
Exactly. Yes. So first of all, we have sung the praises of Jerry Finnerman many, many times on this show.
On your show?
Yes, because he was a genius.
Genius. He acquired that genius from his father. His father was a well-known cinematographer.
So what was it like working with him?
Well, there was one incident, and
Yes.
it tells you everything about him. But here's a guy, usually behind the camera, and if not literally behind the camera, standing behind the camera, taking measurements and all that kind of thing. In the shadows, he's literally the cinematographer, whether he's a cameraman as well or is just being the boss of lights and camera, is in the shadows. You never really see him. You could go the whole day with this shadowy figure saying, all right, but put it at 2.5 and get a measurement 15 feet at 2.5 and open the frame a little more, and that's all you hear from him. So what was Jerry Finnerman like? It never occurred to me to ask, except that on one day at lunch hour, my phone rang in my dressing room where I was presumably eating, and it was my mother on the phone saying, Billy, your father died, and we're in Miami, and he had a stroke, and he died. I learned later that as he was dying, he was crying. And the mystery, he had tears in his eyes, whether it was tears I'm leaving. I mean, how do you feel when you die? How do you feel when you die? You've got gray hair.
Yeah.
You're thinking about it from time to time.
I've thought about it, sure.
That's the past tense. Can you put that in the present tense?
I think about it sometimes, sure.
Time to time?
Time to time.
Most times?
Not most times.
A lot of times?
Occasionally.
Occasionally days, months, weeks?
Maybe weeks.
Weeks. I think about it all the time. I think about it when my breath is short. I think about getting up and, wow, look at this beautiful day. I'm so glad I'm alive. I think about it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Death is right over there. I look at everything, or try to, like I'm never going to see it again. Like I'm looking at you and talking to you, treasuring the words we're saying, because I may never speak again. I may keel over right now.
I hope not. But you were saying about Jerry.
So Jerry, I didn't know until my father died. And then I had to go to Miami to pick his body up at stop production. And I thought, the plane didn't leave until evening. And it was noon. And what am I going to do between noon and evening? I thought, I got to work. So I tried to work. I couldn't remember a word. It was apparently hellacious. But Leonard, my dear friend Leonard Nimoy, and Jerry Finnerman, whom I knew and didn't know, also stood beside me. I was reminded of film I've seen of elephants supporting older members. They would stand beside them and support them in their hugeness. They would put their shoulder there and support the elderly dying elephant until the elephant would crumble and couldn't move on any further. I had that feeling of two bodies beside me the whole time, Leonard and Jerry. And learned later that Jerry's dad, with whom he was working, like he was on the camera and his dad was behind him as the cinematographer, the very shadowy figure I'm talking about, he worked with his dad until his dad died on the set and he was beside his dad.
Wow. I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. So he had such commiseration. He knew what I was going through. And I had this sense of instant identification with the shadowy figure, Jerry Finnerman, a little overweight, Leonard Nimoy, a little underweight, both beside me, trying to comfort me on that monumental death in everybody's life, the death of one or two of their parents.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, since you've written this book, before you wrote this book, you did something that was really, really awesome. You went into space.
I did.
And how was your actual experience different from the experience that people kind of expected you to have?
Well, you see, what you've just enunciated is the problem. Because I wore this costume and sat in this chair and pretended to leave stage 26 for a distant star.
Yeah.
That, hey, folks, it never really happened. So I have no idea what it would be like to go into space. And so through a very obtuse path, I got onto the ship, onto that spaceship, and made it into space. I had seen film of the first voyage, whereby the people there were playing around in weightlessness, and indeed somebody was sprawled out with their legs on their stomach and their legs floating, and somebody was throwing candies at their ass. And I thought, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, right.
So when I went into weightlessness, I immediately went toward the window and looked out the window. I wanted to experience that 3 minutes to its fullest.
Wow. And how do you feel like that experience of those 3 minutes has changed you since you've been, back on terra firma?
When I got back and stepped out of the spaceship, I started weeping, started crying. And I thought, what's the matter with me? Why am I crying? And then I realized I was feeling great sadness.
Yeah.
And I didn't know why. And I had to go off in a corner and think about, why am I crying? Imagine crying and not knowing why you're crying. I've never had that experience. I mean, you always know, oh, God, somebody died, somebody's hurt, I lost a job, Scott Matz wants to talk to me. Oh, I'm going to cry. So it took me a while to understand that I was grieving for the world, for the earth. The very thing that I most caught my attention in the last couple of years is this extraordinary connection that human beings have in the world. I mean, it's a cliche to say, oh, yeah, we're all part of the same building materials. But to hear the stories of the incredible unity, one thing depending on the other, that if you take one thing out of the jigsaw puzzle, the puzzle doesn't look complete. And we humans don't understand so much of this jigsaw puzzle, which is the assemblage of nature. The elk in Yellowstone are disappearing, and they don't know why. And they reintroduced the wolves about 20 years ago. And the elks were destroying the waterways because they weren't afraid of anything now, and they could just splash and drink and stay in the streams, and destroyed the banks. And the banks, without their branches, destroyed the insects. Didn't come around because there was nothing for the insects to eat. So then the birds didn't come, and there were no insects, and the birds didn't come, and there was no droppings from the birds. So that whole unity of nature, the Yellowstone began to decline. So the scientists said, well, let's reintroduce the wolves. So they reintroduced the wolves. The wolves scared the cloven-foot animal, the deer and the elk and the buffaloes, and scared them, as was always the case for eons, back up into the hills. So they would come and drink and go because they didn't want to tangle with the wolves. So now the streams came back, and the bush came back, and the insect came back, and the birds came back, and nature was in harmony. Then the elk started to disappear, and they said, oh, I bet you the wolves are eating the young elk. Well, they hadn't been. No, it couldn't have been the wolves. They began to look around. Then they discovered the fishermen. There were less fishermen in the streams of Montana because there were less fish, less rainbow trout. Why were there less rainbow trout? Then they discovered that they had introduced lake trout into the other lakes. The lake trout were eating the rainbow trout, which was a mainstay of the bears. So the bears, not having the protein of the fish, ate the elk, and the elk were disappearing. So the whole harmony of nature was disturbed by mankind introducing a foreign fish. And that's what's happening in the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're on the precipice of the tragedy of the disappearance of man. Once we disappear, within years, Chesapeake Bay was so polluted we couldn't eat the fish and the shellfish. It was like shellfish. Whole islands in Chesapeake Bay have been made by the bones, the shells of the shellfish by the Indians. They piled the bones, they made islands. There were so many shellfish. No shellfish.
Wow.
Pollution.
Mm-hmm.
They had an edict, no more pollution here, get about it. And within 20 years, Chesapeake Bay is now supplying shellfish to the world. 20 years.
Wow.
Imagine being without us, the world without us for 1,000 years, everything would come back. It's us.
Yeah.
And that's what made me cry.
Wow.
The loss. Things are going extinct that we don't even know about. There are millions of entities that have taken 5 billion years to evolve. And they're going extinct. As you and I are talking, things are dying out. Things, many, lots. And we don't know what they are. We don't know the beauty of what the world evolved. Insects, worms, birds. I drove from Los Angeles to someplace near San Francisco and did a Comic-Con, turned around, came back along Highway 5, along the richest valley maybe in the world, or was, the San Joaquin. And in the years ago when I did that, 20, 30, 40 years ago when I would do that drive, you'd have to stop every 100, 200 miles, scrape the insects off your windshield.
Yeah, sure.
Okay? One insect in 400 miles, 300 miles there, 300 miles away, 600 miles, one insect splat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the most fertile, one of the most fertile places on Earth. Where are the insects?
Right. We're doing the damage. And you know what? You know what, Bill? I think all it takes is this. We can admit that we're killers, but we are not going to kill today. That's all it takes. And yes, I am quoting.
What'd you have for breakfast?
I had Raisin Bran.
What are you going to have for dinner?
Well, I have to go and cover an event tonight in Hollywood. It's the Hollywood Music and Media Awards. So as soon as I'm done with you, I have to get dressed, and I'm probably just going to have to go get takeout.
Well, you're going to take a chicken. You're going to take a.
Oh, I'll probably get like a chicken sandwich or something.
Yeah, so the chickens are destroying the world too. That's interesting. I'm going to be put in the Music Hall of Fame sometime in the summer at the California Music Hall of Fame. It's the California Music Hall of Fame.
Excellent. Congrats.
It's California.
Yeah.
And the Music Hall of Fame. Can you imagine?
That's awesome. And after all those years ago when you first put out Transform Man, now you're getting inducted into the California Music Hall of Fame. Yeah. That's a great
that's a great arc, isn't it?
Oh, excellent arc
of Boldly Go.
Yes, absolutely. One more question for you, Bill, is that at 91, you have this drive that I think people a half your age, a third your age should be envious of. And I know you're always looking to your next adventure. So after the California Music Hall of Fame, what is your next adventure?
I've got so many things going on. I've got a hit show called The Unexplained on the History Channel, which is now streaming on Netflix and everywhere else. And it was number 2, they said. When it first was introduced, went number 2 and then number 3. It's probably not a lot higher than that at the moment, but it's a hit show. They've ordered 35 in the neighborhood of 70 hours for next year.
That's a lot.
You get orders for 10 hours. This is unbelievable. So it's a big hit, and I'm doing all kinds of international publicity. I did a performance at the Kennedy Center with songs that I and Robert Chernow and I wrote. One of which is called "So Fragile, So Blue." It was somewhat about the experience I just described on the spaceship. Rob is a poet that, indescribably good, and the song is monumental. Somebody's putting it up for a Pulitzer Prize, and we're going to do a music video of it. And my dream, my fantasy, is that it becomes a rallying cry, like "We Are the World." This will be a music video. Everybody's contributing their services to this marvelous song done with a 70-piece orchestra. The orchestra there. So that's coming out. We filmed my performance, so that performance is coming out. We did it as an album, so that album is coming out. I've got an album out there now called Bill. This will be called, I don't know, Live.
Bill is awesome. I love it. Yeah, Bill is awesome.
So it goes on and on. The things I'm doing, when I leave you, I'm going to go talk to a producer about a police series that I've got. It goes on. I've got so many things going on. I'm running here and there and trying to read and talk to people like you.
Well, Bill, I cannot thank you enough for talking to people like me today, and thank you.
We never got to all your questions, but I hope you allowed me to ramble on.
I so enjoyed this, and yes, we actually did get to most of them. Listen, we've been going episode by episode of the original show and like breaking it down, and not just scene by scene, but like breaking down the production of it and putting into historical context. And one last thing I got to ask is like me and my co-host and producing partner, Steve Morris,
my co-host and I,
we really break it down. Why the hell do you think this series that you did for 3 years holds up under such scrutiny? Why?
Well, my laughable answer long ago was, hey.
Yeah, it's you.
But obviously that's not the case. In script writing, there are certain rules. You got to have an interesting plot, interesting environment, but you have to have people that you love. So here we are in this world of the future. Oh, you mean there's going to be a future? So out of the detritus of what you and I are talking about the world that will disappear in a generation, it doesn't. It exists. Technology takes us out of it. And we're going to exist. Human beings are going to live. And we're going to be 400 years in the future. Everything's going to be good. And we're going to be exploring, not the eastern coast of the North American continent, but space, where nobody knows and the strange. We know that there are billions and billions of constellations. In those constellations, there are billions and billions of stars. Around those stars, there's billions and billions of planets. There has to be, given the urgency of life on this planet, where every niche is filled with life. I mean, I was reading about the small trees, what do you call it when you nip small trees, make the little Japanese help.
I know what you're talking about. I forget the name of the tree.
Where you have little potted trees.
Yeah. I know the tree. Yeah.
And here, it's an esoteric skill. It's a skill like sculpting. Come on, help me. So I was reading about that, and I was reading about the most valuable of those trees that are then cut down. They're the trees that grow in niches on cliffside, hammered by the winds and by the sun and by the ocean. They survive. They're thousands of years old. They're small, clinging to a cliff. The imperative of life is such that there has to be life everywhere. everywhere that is possible. We know that life exists 650 degrees in the water, and where there are vents in the volcanic chimneys, there are worms and clams and things growing, and there's life going on everywhere. Bacteria lived in space. The things come out of space and land in the ocean, on land, and we see there was bacteria there, alive.
And it's all connected.
It's all connected. So life is all around us. Wait a minute, we think we're the only things in the universe? How bloody egotistical is that?
Yeah, ignorant.
You know? So there's hope invested in Star Trek, that we'll be looking at those miracles of whatever you apply that, whatever you think however you think the miracle came about.
And well, the other thing, Bill, is that we do love these characters.
And you love these characters.
We love these characters. And we are so grateful. I'm so grateful for this interview. It is great seeing you as always. Thank you for joining us on Enterprise Incidents. Keep going boldly, William Shatner.
Yes. Take care, my friend. I'll see you again.
Wow, Scott, I gotta say, first of all, I never know what I'm going to hear from William Shatner, and I think that conversation you had with him went to some amazing places, some personal places, and it was also really, really fun.
I got to tell you, first of all, I am so grateful that he was so generous with his time, because when I reached out about the interview, I said I just need 20 minutes, and he gave me more than 40 minutes for this, and he was not rushed at all. But I just was so grateful for just how comfortable he felt with the conversation, and how at ease he felt with it. But also, I mean, like you pointed out, he was memorizing 10 pages of dialogue a day,
Right.
and then he'd be on to the next one, and on to the next one. So he doesn't remember the details like we do, or certainly like most fans do. But still, the conversation for his new book, Boldly Go, which I think is a terrific book, and I really, really recommend it. It's so profound to read during these times. But also, this guy's 91 years old. He's lived a lot of life, and he's closer to the end than the beginning. And just, it's a really profound conversation that I think really fits in so great with so many of the ideals that we talked about when it came to Star Trek. And I just really, to be able to bring a Shatner interview to Enterprise Incidents. So for everyone, all our loyal Enterprisers who've been listening from the beginning, to sort of bring our deep dives of the original series to a close with a special interview exclusive to Enterprise Incidents with the man himself, I just feel very, 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 very grateful. And grateful to everyone listening, and to you, Steve, for all the magic you've worked, and just being just this awesome, awesome, awesome partner. You were the Spock to my Kirk, and I love you for it.
Well, same, my friend. And the fact is, I couldn't have brought William Shatner in to do an interview, so that is all you. And I think the fact that we have a Shatner and a Nimoy on this episode is pretty damn cool.
That is amazing. We have Shatner and Nimoy, Adam Nimoy, on this episode of Enterprise Incidents. That is indeed cool. So, Adam, I just want to thank you again for joining us again on Enterprise Incidents. This was definitely the conversation I wanted to have about all our yesterdays and then some. But what do you have coming up that we should all look out for?
Well, I am putting in the final revisions on another memoir that I've written about, in large part, about my relationship with my dad, the complicated nature of that relationship, how it was further complicated by the Star Trek years during the formative years of my relationship with my dad, and a lot of difficult experiences that we have, some of which we explore in For the Love of Spock. But there's a lot of emphasis on how 12-step recovery really brought my dad and I back together, to the point where we had a very close and loving relationship the last years of his life, so much so that when my second wife, Martha, was diagnosed with cancer, and terminal cancer, that my dad was very supportive of me, and very much the dad that I always wanted him to be, that he simply could not be, because he's just not raised that way. His parents and him had a very also kind of a tenuous relationship. So it's a lot about it's a memoir about recovery, and it's about making amends to my father, But before I did that, I had to learn how to make an amends to my Jewish mother, who drove me crazy, my ex-wife, who challenged me constantly, and my teenage daughter. And all this was so that I could try to forge a new relationship with my kids, particularly my own son. That conflict is something that is really endemic in our Jewish tradition between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of our religion and our Jewish way of life. And the book is kind of an exploration of all those facets that I had to go through before I could really start to come to terms with my relationship with my dad, which ended on a, as I say, really, really close and loving note, which I was very grateful for.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We will keep an eye out on that for sure. And Adam Nimoy, once again, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Incidents.
Thank you for having me, you guys. Scott and Steve, it's always an honor and a pleasure to be here with you.
And if people wanted to find you, Adam, online on social media, how would they go about doing that?
Well, Steve, interesting you asked that. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is @ and lowercase Adam_Nimoy. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, you can find me at _graduate, all lowercase, 68. Again, that's lowercase _graduate 68. My favorite film.
So, of course, we had a lot to say about all our yesterdays. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And the first place that we have our best conversations is on our Facebook page. You can search for Enterprise Incidents. But we also have great interactions with you on Twitter at Enter Incidents and on Instagram at Enterprise Incidents. And of course, if you haven't already, we'd love you to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, where you can leave a review. But if Apple Podcasts isn't your thing, we're also on YouTube, on Spotify, on Stitcher, on Overcast, on iHeart. Everywhere you can get a podcast, you can listen to Enterprise Incidents. And if you want to support the show, the best thing to do is write in those show notes. At the very top is a link to Anchor, where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month or as much as $9.99 a month. We'd like to think of it as a tip jar. If you enjoyed having your little conversation with Enterprise Incidents today, maybe drop a little in the jar and help us out. And if you want to reach me, you can do it on SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram, and on my other podcast, The Cinephiles. One thing I'm not sure that I mentioned, but every year we do a deep dive on a particular director. It started with Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, then to Hitchcock with Vertigo and Rear Window, off to Akira Kurosawa with The Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, then Francis Ford Coppola with all the Godfather films. This year was Spike Lee with Do the Right Thing and Malcolm X. And coming up in January, we're going into a new director. I cannot name their name yet, but is a director that is working currently, one of the most popular, controversial, and influential directors of the last 20 years. We're going to do a deep dive on his films, and we'd love to have you join us for it.
Well,
Scott,
that's a great tease. But Steve, in the keeping with the theme of time travel, what time travel movies have you featured on the Cinephiles?
It's funny, I didn't mention them because we've done other time travel things, so I didn't bring them up. But two that I can think of off the top of my head are Planet of the Apes, Terminator 1 and 2, and of course, Back to the Future.
Of course. And you got to listen to those episodes if you love movies. And of course you do. You got to listen to the Cinephiles, which is the other show, the other podcast that Steve does with our great friend, John Stephen Roca. But meanwhile, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Mance. And like Steve said, if you could be so generous to support us by making a very generous donation for these amazing episodes of Enterprise Incidents that we worked very, very, very hard to bring to you. It has been a labor of love in every sense of the word, but the key word is labor, so we appreciate any support. And of course, like Steve mentioned, please leave a review for Enterprise Incidents on Apple Podcasts. So, Enterprisers, we have reached that point. I cannot believe I'm going to say what I am about to say, but we are at this point. We have one more episode to go. One more episode of Star Trek, one more episode of the original series to cover on Enterprise Incidents. And love it or hate it, we're doing it next. It is Turnabout Intruder. I am sure the very mention of that episode brings to mind images from that episode that maybe you wish you could unsee, or maybe not. Maybe the episode will have a different meaning to you after almost 55 years. But Turnabout Intruder is next. So do join us for the final deep dive episode of the original series, along with news about what is next on Enterprise Incidents on the next episode of Enterprise Incidents. And until then, keep going boldly.